Welcome, guardian of the night, to a journey through the shadows of Wayne Manor, where candlelight flickers against mahogany walls and the echoes of a lifetime's secrets whisper through empty corridors. Tonight, we shall explore the untold chronicles of Alfred Pennyworth, the man whose quiet dignity masks a past filled with adventure, sacrifice, and mysteries that even the world's greatest detective has yet to uncover. Let the rhythm of grandfather clocks and the rustle of aged leather carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace the hidden threads of the most trusted man in Gotham's darkest night's life. Close your eyes, keeper of secrets, and let these tales unfold like old photographs in a forgotten drawer. In the gentle rolling hills of the English countryside, where ancient oaks cast long shadows across manicured lawns and the morning mist clung to stone walls that had stood for centuries, there came into the world a child whose destiny would be forever intertwined with service. Though none who witnessed his first breath could have imagined the extraordinary path his life would take, Alfred Thaddeus Crane Pennyworth drew his initial breath on a crisp autumn morning in 1893. In the servants' quarters of Pennyworth Manor, a grand estate that had housed his family's devotion to noble service for more generations than any living person could accurately count. The manor itself stood as a testament to the enduring nature of English tradition. Its grey stone walls, weathered by countless seasons yet unyielding in their strength, much like the character that would define the Pennyworth lineage. The ivy that climbed its eastern face had been planted by Alfred's great-grandfather, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in the servants' hall, for he had saved the life of a duke during a hunting accident and had been rewarded not with gold or land, but with something far more precious to the Pennyworth family: the promise of eternal employment and the honor of serving nobility with distinction. The room where Alfred entered the world was modest yet immaculate, furnished with the simple elegance that marked all Pennyworth possessions. A single window looked out upon the kitchen gardens, where vegetables grew in perfectly straight rows and herbs released their fragrance into the morning air. The midwife who attended his birth noted with satisfaction that the child's first cry was strong and clear, yet not so loud as to disturb the sleeping household above stairs. Even in his earliest moments, it seemed, Alfred understood the importance of discretion and the proper conduct expected of one born to serve. His father, Jarvis Pennyworth, received the news of his son's arrival with the same quiet dignity that characterized all his actions. At 42 years of age, Jarvis had already served as head butler to Lord Pemberton for nearly 2 decades, earning a reputation throughout the county for his uncompromising standards and his ability to manage a household staff with firm kindness and unwavering fairness. He was a man of medium height and slender build, with steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, and hands that could fold a napkin into perfect geometric precision, or polish silver until it gleamed like starlight. The tradition of service that flowed through Alfred's veins was not merely a matter of employment, but a sacred calling that had defined his family's identity since the reign of Good Queen Bess. His ancestors had served lords and ladies, dukes and duchesses, earning reputations for loyalty that transcended the simple exchange of labor for wages to become something approaching a noble calling in its own right. They were the invisible hands that maintained the great houses of England, the quiet voices that spoke only when spoken to, the watchful eyes that observed all yet revealed nothing that might compromise their master's dignity or safety. Jarvis understood better than most that the life of service was not one that could be forced upon an unwilling soul. Yet he also knew that the skills and values that defined a proper gentleman's gentleman were not innate gifts, but carefully cultivated abilities that required years of patient instruction and constant practice. From the moment Alfred could walk, his father began the gentle process of education that would prepare him for the life that tradition and birth had seemingly predetermined for him. The lessons began simply enough, with instruction in proper posture and diction. For a servant who could not present himself with dignity could hardly be expected to maintain the dignity of his master's household. Alfred learned to stand straight without appearing rigid, to speak clearly without raising his voice, to move through rooms with purposeful silence that announced competence without drawing attention to itself. These were not mere affectations, but essential tools of his expected trade, ways of being in the world that would allow him to serve without intruding, to observe without being observed, to anticipate needs before they were expressed. The Pennyworth family quarters consisted of 3 small but comfortable rooms on the manor's second floor, positioned strategically between the grand family apartments above and the bustling servants' quarters below. This placement was not accidental, but reflected Jarvis's elevated position in the household hierarchy, a recognition of his indispensability that granted him privileges that other servants could never hope to achieve. The sitting room contained a small library of books that Jarvis had accumulated over the years, volumes on history and literature and philosophy that he read by candlelight after his daily duties were complete. Alfred's earliest memories were formed in this environment of quiet scholarship and disciplined routine, where each day began before dawn with the striking of the hall clock and ended only when the last candle was extinguished and the last door was locked. He learned to appreciate the rhythm of service, the way that each task flowed seamlessly into the next, creating a symphony of efficiency that supported the grander melodies being played out in the public rooms above stairs. The other children in his world were the sons and daughters of cooks and maids, gardeners and grooms, all born into the same tradition of service, yet each carrying different expectations and possibilities. Alfred formed friendships with these children that would endure throughout his youth, bonds forged in the shared understanding of their unique position in the world, neither master nor entirely servant, but something in between, inheritors of a proud tradition, yet also prisoners of circumstances they had not chosen. Among these childhood companions was young Emily Hartford, daughter of the head cook, whose quick wit and boundless curiosity made her Alfred's closest confidant during their early years. She possessed an infectious laugh and an uncanny ability to find joy in the simplest pleasures, qualities that brought light to Alfred's sometimes overly serious nature. Together they would explore the vast manor during their few hours of leisure, discovering hidden passages and forgotten rooms, creating games and adventures that transformed their circumscribed world into a realm of infinite possibility. There was also Thomas Whitmore, son of the stable master, whose fascination with horses and mechanical devices provided Alfred with his first glimpse into worlds beyond the manor's walls. Thomas possessed an intuitive understanding of how things worked, whether they were living creatures or complex machines, and he shared this knowledge freely with his friend, teaching Alfred to recognize the signs of a well-trained horse or the sound of an engine that was not running properly. These lessons would prove invaluable in years to come, though neither boy could have imagined how such seemingly trivial knowledge would one day save lives and solve crimes. The education that Jarvis provided for his son extended far beyond the practical skills of service to encompass languages, mathematics, literature, and history. He believed firmly that a man who would serve the educated classes must himself be educated, not merely in the mechanics of his duties, but in the broader understanding of the world that would allow him to anticipate his master's needs and engage meaningfully with the complex situations that arose in households where power and influence intersected with daily life. Alfred proved to be an eager and gifted student, displaying a particular aptitude for languages that delighted his father and impressed the tutors who were occasionally brought in to supplement his education. By the age of 10, he could speak French with passable fluency and had begun to master the rudiments of German and Italian, skills that would serve him well in a world where the British aristocracy maintained connections across all of Europe and frequently entertained foreign guests whose comfort and satisfaction depended upon having servants who could all communicate in their native tongues. The boy also demonstrated a remarkable memory for faces and names, an ability to recall conversations and preferences that had been mentioned only in passing, and a talent for reading the subtle signs of mood and emotion that allowed him to adjust his behavior and responses to match the needs of each situation. These were not merely natural gifts, but capabilities that he developed through careful observation and constant practice, spending hours studying the interactions between his father and Lord Pemberton, learning to recognize the tiny signals that indicated pleasure or displeasure, satisfaction or concern. Yet, even as Alfred excelled in his preparation for a life of service, there were signs that his soul harbored dreams and ambitions that could not be contained within the traditional boundaries of his expected role. He displayed a particular fascination with the theatrical performances that occasionally took place in the manor's great hall, watching with rapt attention as traveling companies of actors transformed themselves into kings and queens, lovers and villains, bringing stories to life through the magic of costume and voice and gesture. These performances stirred something deep within Alfred's heart, a longing for expression and creativity that seemed at odds with the restraint and self-effacement that defined proper service. He would practice speeches in secret, experimenting with different voices and accents, imagining himself upon the stage, bringing joy and wonder to audiences who would applaud his artistry rather than simply accepting his competent invisibility. The weight of expectation that surrounded Alfred's upbringing was both blessing and burden, providing him with purpose and direction, while also limiting his freedom to explore the full range of his capabilities and interests. Jarvis loved his son deeply and wanted nothing more than to see him succeed and prosper. Yet his definition of success was necessarily constrained by the realities of their social position and the limited opportunities available to someone of Alfred's birth and circumstances. The lessons in observation and discretion that formed such a crucial part of Alfred's education were reinforced daily through exposure to the complex dynamics of manor life, where secrets and scandals, alliances and betrayals played out in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. He learned to see without appearing to look, to hear without seeming to listen, to understand situations and relationships that were never explicitly explained to him but which could be decoded through careful attention to the subtle signs that adults thought children could not comprehend. The mystery of his mother's death when he was barely 6 years old cast a long shadow over Alfred's childhood, creating questions that Jarvis would never fully answer, and leaving an emotional void that shaped the boy's understanding of loss and responsibility. Mary Catherine Pennyworth had been beloved by all who knew her, a woman of gentle spirit and quick intelligence, who had brought warmth and laughter to the servants' quarters, and had been particularly cherished by the lady of the manor, who had treated her more as a friend than as an employee. The circumstances of her death were never discussed in Alfred's presence, but he overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that it had been sudden and unexpected, possibly involving some form of accident or illness that had claimed her life despite the best efforts of the local physician. The grief that consumed his father in the weeks following her funeral was a terrible thing to witness, transforming the composed and capable man into someone almost unrecognizable, though Jarvis never allowed his personal anguish to interfere with his professional responsibilities. This early encounter with profound loss taught Alfred important lessons about the necessity of maintaining one's duties, even in the face of overwhelming personal pain, about the importance of finding strength in service to others when one's own world seemed to be crumbling. He watched his father slowly rebuild his life around work and responsibility, channeling his grief into an even more devoted commitment to excellence in his chosen calling. The absence of his mother's nurturing presence meant that Alfred's emotional education came primarily from his father and from the other women in the household, who took pity on the motherless boy and offered what comfort and guidance they could provide. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, became something of a surrogate maternal figure, teaching Alfred the softer skills of human interaction and helping him understand the importance of kindness and compassion in all his dealings with others. From her, Alfred learned that true service was not mere mechanical competence, but a form of care that considered the whole person being served, anticipating not only practical needs but emotional ones as well. She taught him to recognize when someone was troubled or sad, to offer comfort without overstepping boundaries, to provide support without drawing attention to his own generous actions. These lessons in empathy and emotional intelligence would prove to be among the most valuable gifts of his childhood, shaping his approach to relationships throughout his entire life. The analytical mind that would later serve Alfred so well in very different circumstances began to develop during these formative years, as he learned to process the complex information that flowed through the manor house, and to identify patterns and connections that might not be immediately obvious to others. He became adept at predicting which guests would require special attention, which social situations might become awkward or difficult, which combinations of personalities might lead to conflict or misunderstanding. His protective instincts, too, began to manifest during childhood, though they were directed primarily toward defending the dignity and reputation of the Pemberton family and maintaining the smooth operation of the household that his father supervised with such skill and dedication. Alfred learned to recognize potential problems before they became serious issues, to deflect difficult situations with tact and diplomacy, to serve as a buffer between the family and any disruptions that might threaten their comfort or peace of mind. The seasonal rhythms of manor life provided Alfred with a deep appreciation for tradition and continuity, as the same ceremonies and celebrations were observed year after year with careful attention to precedent and proper form. Christmas brought elaborate decorations and formal dinners that required weeks of preparation, while summer house parties tested the staff's ability to accommodate dozens of guests without allowing any detail of comfort or entertainment to be overlooked. These experiences taught Alfred to plan ahead, to coordinate complex activities involving multiple people and competing priorities, to maintain high standards, even under pressure, and to find satisfaction in the successful execution of difficult tasks that others might not even notice when they were performed well. The invisible nature of truly excellent service became one of his earliest and most important lessons, the understanding that the highest praise a servant could receive was the complete absence of complaints or concerns about his work. As Alfred approached his teenage years, the question of his future began to loom larger in family discussions and planning. Jarvis had begun to introduce his son to the wider network of noble houses and their staffs, connections that could provide opportunities for advancement and career development when the time came for Alfred to seek his own position. The prospect of eventually serving as a butler in his own right, perhaps at a manor house comparable to Pemberton's, or even grander, represented the pinnacle of achievement for someone of his background and training. Yet even as these conventional plans took shape, Alfred continued to nurture the secret dreams that pulled his heart in very different directions, imagining himself on the stages of London's great theatres, bringing characters to life before audiences who would celebrate his artistry and creativity. The tension between duty and desire that would define so many of the crucial decisions in his life was already beginning to assert itself, creating internal conflicts that would only grow stronger as he matured and began to understand the full implications of choosing one path over another. The childhood of Alfred Pennyworth thus drew to a close in an atmosphere of expectation and possibility, with the foundations of his character firmly established, yet his ultimate destiny still unwritten, waiting to be determined by choices that would test everything he had learned about service, loyalty, courage, and the price of following one's heart in a world that offered few second chances and demanded absolute commitment to whatever path one chose to follow. The years that followed Alfred's 16th birthday brought with them a restlessness that could no longer be contained within the familiar rhythms of manor life, a stirring of the soul that whispered of possibilities beyond the carefully prescribed boundaries of hereditary service. Though he continued to excel in his preparation for a traditional career in household management, demonstrating the same meticulous attention to detail and quiet competence that had made his father indispensable to Lord Pemberton, there burned within him a flame that yearned for expression in ways that no amount of silver polishing or guest reception could satisfy. The discovery of his passion for the theatrical arts came not through any grand revelation, but through a series of small moments that gradually coalesced into an understanding so profound it would reshape his entire conception of what his life might become. It began innocuously enough during the winter of 1909, when a travelling company of actors arrived at Pemberton Manor to perform for the Christmas festivities, bringing with them not only their carefully rehearsed entertainment, but also an energy and vitality that seemed to transform the very air within the ancient walls. Alfred had observed such performances before, always from his designated position among the household staff, maintaining the proper demeanour of respectful attention, while ensuring that the family's needs were anticipated and met throughout the evening. Yet on this particular night, something different occurred as he watched the lead actor embody the role of King Lear, witnessing the complete transformation of an ordinary man into a figure of tragic nobility, whose every gesture and inflection carried weight and meaning that reached into the deepest chambers of the human heart. The technical mastery that the performance required was immediately apparent to Alfred's trained eye, accustomed as he was to recognizing and appreciating excellence in all its forms. The actor's voice control, his precise timing, his ability to project emotion across a large room while maintaining the intimate connection that drew each observer into the story, all represented skills that demanded the same dedication and practice that Alfred had always associated with the finest examples of household service. Yet what captivated him most profoundly was the glimpse he caught behind the scenes, when circumstances required him to assist with some minor stage arrangements and he observed the actors preparing for their performance. Here was a world where transformation was not only possible but expected, where individuals could become entirely different people through the application of skill and imagination, where the constraints of birth and circumstance could be transcended through the magic of artistic creation. The conversation he overheard between the company's director and the leading lady revealed layers of complexity in their craft that Alfred had never suspected. Discussions of motivation and subtext, of the psychological truth that must underlie even the most fantastical characters, of the responsibility that artists bore to their audiences and to the stories they chose to tell. These were people who took their work as seriously as his father took his duties, yet their labor was devoted to the creation of beauty and meaning rather than merely the maintenance of comfort and order. In the days that followed the company's departure, Alfred found himself returning again and again to memories of what he had witnessed, analyzing the techniques he had observed, and wondering whether he possessed any similar capabilities. The mirror in his small chamber became a stage where he experimented with different expressions and postures, testing his ability to convey emotion through physical presence and vocal inflection. The privacy of his room allowed him to explore aspects of his personality that had no place in his daily routine, to discover reserves of passion and creativity that had been carefully suppressed in service of the controlled demeanor that his position demanded. The books in his father's library took on new significance as Alfred began to seek out plays and poetry that he could use for practice material, discovering in Shakespeare and Marlowe, in Sheridan and Wilde, characters and situations that challenged him to stretch beyond the comfortable boundaries of his established identity. The speeches he memorized in secret became vehicles for exploring different voices and personalities, exercises in empathy that taught him to understand and inhabit perspectives radically different from his own. The skills he developed through these clandestine rehearsals proved unexpectedly useful in his regular duties, as his enhanced awareness of vocal tone and body language made him more sensitive to the moods and needs of the family he served. His ability to modulate his own presence according to the requirements of each situation improved markedly, allowing him to provide exactly the right type and level of service for any occasion. Yet these practical benefits were merely pleasant side effects of a pursuit that had become its own reward, a source of joy and fulfillment that made even the most mundane tasks bearable. The internal conflict that this discovery created was both exhilarating and terrifying, opening up vistas of possibility that Alfred had never dared to imagine, while simultaneously threatening to undermine everything that his family had worked for generations to achieve. The Pennyworth name carried weight and respect throughout the households of England's nobility, a reputation built through centuries of faithful service and maintained through the absolute reliability of each successive generation. To abandon this legacy in pursuit of an uncertain career in the theatre would not only risk his own future, but potentially taint the family honor that meant more to his father than life itself. The weight of tradition that had once provided comfort and direction now felt like chains that constrained Alfred's ability to explore his true capabilities and desires. The path that had been laid out for him was safe and secure, offering the promise of steady advancement and eventual achievement of the highest levels of domestic service. Yet it also represented a form of cage that would contain and limit his potential for the remainder of his life. The question that tormented his sleepless nights was whether security and respectability were sufficient compensation for the sacrifice of dreams that called to him with increasing urgency. The turning point came during his 18th year, when a series of circumstances combined to create an opportunity that would test his courage and commitment in ways he had never anticipated. Lord Pemberton had announced his intention to spend several months in London during the social season, requiring a substantial portion of his household staff to accompany him and maintain his residence in the capital, while he participated in the round of parties and political activities that defined his public life. For Alfred, this represented his first extended stay in London, a city whose theatres and cultural attractions had featured prominently in his secret dreams, but which remained largely unknown to him, except through books and newspapers. The prospect of being within walking distance of the great stages where legendary actors performed the greatest roles in dramatic literature was both thrilling and daunting, offering possibilities for education and inspiration that could never be found in the countryside. The London house that would serve as their temporary residence was located in Mayfair, positioned strategically among the homes of other prominent families and within easy reach of the clubs and venues where the aristocracy conducted their business and pleasure. The staff quarters, though more cramped than those at Pemberton Manor, were comfortable enough and included a small room where Alfred could continue his private rehearsals without fear of discovery. The rhythm of London life proved to be markedly different from the peaceful routine of the country estate, with constant streams of visitors and invitations creating a whirlwind of activity that tested the household staff's ability to maintain their usual standards of service, while adapting to new challenges and expectations. Yet for Alfred, the energy and excitement of the city were intoxicating, providing stimulation and inspiration that made even the longest days feel abbreviated. His duties required him to accompany Lord Pemberton to various social functions, serving as his personal attendant and ensuring that his appearance and comfort were maintained at the highest possible level throughout each engagement. These occasions provided Alfred with unprecedented opportunities to observe the mannerisms and speech patterns of London's elite, studying the subtle variations in accent and behaviour that distinguished different levels of society and different regions of the empire. The knowledge he gained through these observations proved invaluable when he finally gathered the courage to attend his first theatrical performance as a member of the audience rather than as a working servant. Using his limited free time and carefully saved wages, he purchased a ticket for a production of Hamlet at the Lyceum Theatre, positioning himself in the upper galleries, where his presence would not be noted by any members of the Pemberton household who might be attending the more prestigious seating areas. The experience of watching professional actors perform Shakespeare from the perspective of a paying customer rather than a servant was transformative in ways that Alfred had not anticipated. The intimacy and immediacy of live theatre, the collective response of the audience to moments of comedy and tragedy, the electricity that flowed between performers and spectators, all combined to create an atmosphere of shared humanity that transcended the social boundaries that normally defined his existence. More importantly, the performance demonstrated to Alfred that his private experiments with voice and gesture had given him genuine insight into the craft of acting, allowing him to appreciate subtleties of technique and interpretation that might have escaped a less prepared observer. His ability to recognize and analyze what made certain moments effective while others fell flat suggested that he possessed not only enthusiasm for the theatre, but actual aptitude for understanding its complexities. The weeks that followed were filled with clandestine visits to as many productions as his schedule and finances would allow, each experience adding to his knowledge and deepening his conviction that this was the world where he truly belonged. He began to recognize individual actors across different roles, studying their techniques and learning to identify the qualities that distinguished merely competent performers from those who possessed genuine artistry and the ability to create magic on the stage. The decision to seek formal training at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts was not made lightly or quickly, but evolved gradually as Alfred became convinced that half measures and amateur dabbling would never satisfy the hunger that consumed him. The Academy represented the pinnacle of theatrical education in Britain, training ground for the most celebrated actors of the day. Yet, gaining admission required not only talent and dedication, but also the financial resources to support several years of intensive study. The application process itself was daunting for someone of Alfred's background, requiring letters of recommendation and demonstrations of ability that seemed designed to exclude anyone who had not been born into circumstances that provided early exposure to the arts. Yet his years of careful observation and secret practice had prepared him better than he realized, and his audition piece, delivered with the controlled intensity that had been honed through countless private rehearsals, impressed the faculty sufficiently to earn him a place in the incoming class. The challenge of financing his education was resolved through a combination of his own savings, accumulated through years of careful frugality, and a small inheritance from his mother's family that had been held in trust until his coming of age. The amount was sufficient to cover tuition and basic living expenses for the duration of the program, though it would require him to live simply and work part-time to supplement his income. The most difficult aspect of his decision was the conversation with his father, a man whose entire life had been devoted to preparing his son for a very different future. Jarvis received the news of Alfred's plans with the stoic composure that characterized all his responses to unexpected developments. Yet the pain and disappointment in his eyes were unmistakable, reflecting not only personal hurt, but genuine fear for his son's welfare and future security. The argument that followed was conducted with the controlled courtesy that both men maintained even in moments of intense emotion, yet the fundamental disagreement it revealed was profound and seemingly irreconcilable. Jarvis spoke eloquently of the honor and stability that came with traditional service, of the respect and security that the Pennyworth name could guarantee, of the risks and uncertainties that awaited anyone who chose to pursue a career in the notoriously unstable world of professional theatre. Alfred's response drew upon all his skills of persuasion and diplomacy, yet at its core lay a simple truth that could not be argued away or rationalized into acceptance. He could not spend his life in service to others' dreams while ignoring the calling of his own heart. The passion that drove him toward the stage was not a whim or fancy that might be satisfied through amateur involvement, but a fundamental aspect of his identity that demanded expression and development regardless of the costs or risks involved. The compromise they eventually reached reflected both men's love and respect for each other, even as it acknowledged the impossibility of reconciling their different visions of what Alfred's future should contain. He would complete his training at the academy and pursue his theatrical ambitions for a specified period, after which he would reassess his situation and consider whether circumstances might warrant a return to more conventional employment. This arrangement provided Jarvis with hope that his son might eventually return to the family tradition while allowing Alfred the opportunity to test his dreams against reality. The years at the Royal Academy proved to be the most challenging and rewarding of Alfred's young life, stretching his capabilities and forcing him to grow in ways he had never anticipated. The curriculum was demanding and comprehensive, covering not only the obvious skills of voice and movement, but also the intellectual foundations that supported great acting, literature and history, psychology and philosophy, the cultural context that gave meaning to the classics, and the contemporary works that reflected modern concerns and sensibilities. His fellow students came from a variety of backgrounds, though most possessed advantages of birth or fortune that had eased their path to the academy in ways that Alfred's had not been eased. Yet the democratic nature of artistic endeavor meant that talent and dedication were ultimately more important than social position, and Alfred's combination of natural ability and intense work ethic quickly earned him the respect of both peers and instructors. The friendships he formed during this period were unlike any he had previously experienced, based not on shared circumstances of birth or employment, but on common passion for the craft they were learning together. These relationships were conducted on terms of equality that were entirely new to Alfred, who had grown up in a world where every interaction was shaped by considerations of rank and proper deference. The freedom to speak openly about ideas and ambitions, to engage in spirited debates about interpretation and technique, to collaborate as equals in the exploration of challenging material, all contributed to an intellectual and emotional awakening that transformed his understanding of human relationships. His instructors recognized in Alfred a student of unusual promise, someone who combined technical proficiency with genuine emotional depth and the kind of disciplined work ethic that was essential for success in professional theatre. His background in service, rather than proving to be a disadvantage, actually enhanced his ability to understand and portray characters from a wide range of social positions while his natural observational skills allowed him to develop nuanced performances that avoided the stereotypes and caricatures that marred the work of less perceptive actors. The stage name he adopted for his professional career reflected both his desire to establish a new identity separate from his family heritage and his recognition that success in theatre often required a certain theatrical quality even in one's public persona. The name he chose, while bearing no resemblance to his birth name, somehow captured essential qualities of his character, while also possessing the kind of memorable quality that might help audiences and critics remember his performances. His early roles in Academy productions demonstrated his versatility and range, earning him increasingly significant parts and the attention of professional directors and agents who regularly attended student performances in search of promising new talent. The reviews in the theatrical press, while brief, were uniformly positive, noting his natural stage presence and his ability to find fresh insights in familiar material. The transition from student to professional actor was facilitated by connections formed during his academy years, as instructors and visiting professionals recommended him for auditions and small roles that provided essential experience and modest income. His first professional engagement was in a supporting role in a revival of a popular melodrama, hardly the most artistically fulfilling material, but an opportunity to learn the rhythms and requirements of professional production while earning wages that helped support his modest lifestyle. The skills he had learned during his years of service proved unexpectedly valuable in navigating the complex social dynamics of theatrical companies, where egos and insecurities could create conflicts that threatened the success of productions. His ability to read people and situations, to provide support and encouragement without drawing attention to himself, to mediate disputes and smooth over personality conflicts, made him a valued company member, even when his roles were relatively small. His growing reputation led to increasingly substantial parts, and eventually to leading roles that showcased his full range of capabilities. The critics began to take notice of his work, praising his intelligence and emotional honesty, his ability to find the human truth in even the most artificial dramatic situations. The audiences responded to his performances with the kind of enthusiasm that indicated genuine connection and appreciation, suggesting that he possessed that indefinable quality of charisma that separated merely competent actors from those who could command attention and affection. Yet even as his career flourished, and his artistic ambitions were fulfilled in ways that exceeded his most optimistic expectations, Alfred found himself increasingly troubled by questions about the ultimate value and meaning of his chosen profession. The world of theatre, while offering opportunities for creative expression and artistic achievement, also revealed itself to be a realm of considerable vanity and self-absorption, where the pursuit of fame and recognition often took precedence over the nobler goals of truth and beauty that had originally inspired his commitment to the craft. The realization that success in his chosen field might require compromises that conflicted with his fundamental values created a crisis of conscience that forced him to reconsider not only his career path but his understanding of what constituted a meaningful and worthwhile life. The lessons in service and selflessness that his father had taught him, which had seemed restrictive and limiting during his youth, began to appear in a different light as he observed the consequences of unchecked ego and untempered ambition in the theatrical world. The call back to family service came not as an external summons but as an internal recognition that his true gifts and deepest satisfactions lay not in the spotlight but in the shadows, not in receiving applause, but in enabling others to achieve their own forms of greatness. The decision to leave the theatre at the height of his success was perhaps the most difficult he had ever made, yet it was also the most true to his fundamental nature and the values that had been instilled in him from his earliest years. The farewell performances that marked the end of his theatrical career were bittersweet affairs, celebrated by critics and audiences who recognized that they were witnessing the departure of a genuinely gifted artist from their midst. Yet Alfred himself felt not loss but relief, the satisfaction that came from having tested his dreams against reality and discovered both their power and their limitations, emerging with a deeper understanding of where his true calling lay, and the wisdom to embrace it without reservation or regret. The storm clouds that gathered across Europe in the autumn of 1939 brought with them more than the promise of rain and wind, carrying instead the dark harbinger of a conflict that would reshape not only the political boundaries of nations, but the very souls of those who lived through its terrible crucible. For Alfred Pennyworth, now 26 years of age, and settled into what he had assumed would be the peaceful rhythm of his father's profession, the declaration of war represented a summons to service of an entirely different nature than any his family had ever known, a calling that would test not only his physical courage, but the moral foundations upon which his entire understanding of duty and honor had been constructed. The recruitment into His Majesty's Secret Service came not through any dramatic midnight visit or mysterious envelope slipped beneath his door, but rather through a conversation that took place in the oak-panelled library of Pemberton Manor on a crisp October morning, when a gentleman caller arrived ostensibly to discuss genealogical research, but whose true purpose became apparent only after the household staff had been dismissed and the heavy doors had been closed against unwanted ears. Colonel Reginald Fairfax of the Special Operations Executive was a man whose unremarkable appearance and mild demeanor masked capabilities and experiences that would have astonished anyone who knew him only through casual acquaintance. His grey eyes held depths that spoke of secrets carefully guarded and burdens willingly accepted, while his precise movements and alert posture suggested training that went far beyond the conventional education of an English gentleman. When he spoke to Alfred about the possibility of serving his country in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged or officially recognized, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The skills that Alfred had developed during his years in theatrical training proved to be precisely the qualifications that made him valuable to an organization whose operatives needed to assume false identities and maintain elaborate deceptions under the most challenging circumstances. His ability to alter his voice and mannerisms, to adopt different personalities with convincing authenticity, to observe and analyze human behavior with extraordinary precision, all represented capabilities that could mean the difference between successful completion of vital missions and catastrophic failure that might cost not only his own life, but the lives of countless others. The decision to accept Fairfax's invitation was not made lightly, requiring Alfred to consider not only his own safety and future, but the impact that his departure would have upon his father and the Pemberton household that depended upon the continuity of their service. Yet the nature of the conflict that was engulfing civilization itself made personal considerations seem almost trivial in comparison to the larger questions of freedom and tyranny that would be decided by the courage and sacrifice of individuals who chose to answer their country's call, regardless of the personal costs involved. The training facility where Alfred reported for his initial instruction was hidden in the Scottish Highlands, a remote castle whose medieval architecture concealed thoroughly modern facilities for preparing agents to operate behind enemy lines in conditions of extreme danger and isolation. The program that awaited him was designed to transform ordinary civilians into highly skilled operatives, capable of surviving and succeeding in environments where capture meant not merely imprisonment, but torture and death, where every moment required constant vigilance and every decision carried consequences that could affect the outcome of entire campaigns. The physical conditioning that formed the foundation of his training pushed Alfred's body to limits he had never imagined possible, building strength and endurance that would enable him to function effectively despite inadequate food, insufficient sleep, and the constant stress of maintaining false identities while avoiding detection by increasingly sophisticated enemy security forces. The hours spent in brutal exercise and combat practice were balanced by equally demanding sessions devoted to developing mental resilience and emotional control that would prevent panic or despair from compromising his effectiveness when circumstances became desperate. The technical skills that he mastered during those months of intensive preparation encompassed every aspect of clandestine warfare, from the use of weapons and explosives to the operation of radio equipment and coding devices that would enable him to maintain communication with London despite the vast distances and hostile territories that would separate him from his handlers. He learned to pick locks and forge documents, to navigate by stars, and read maps with precision that could save his life when landmarks had been destroyed and familiar routes had become impassable. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his training, requiring him to confront the reality that his mission might require him to kill not only enemy soldiers, but civilians whose only crime was cooperation with occupying forces, to make decisions that would result in the deaths of innocent people, if such sacrifices were necessary to achieve larger strategic objectives. The moral complexity of this role was acknowledged by his instructors, but presented as an inevitable aspect of warfare that must be accepted by anyone who chose to serve in ways that conventional soldiers could not. The code name that was assigned to Alfred for his operational career reflected both security requirements and the peculiar humor that characterized the intelligence services, combining elements of classical mythology with contemporary cultural references in ways that would be meaningless to enemy interceptors while providing his handlers with easy identification. The identity documents that supported his cover required months of careful preparation, creating a fictional biography that could withstand careful scrutiny while providing plausible explanations for his presence in whatever locations his missions might require him to visit. His first assignment took him to occupied France in the spring of 1941, when the German military apparatus was at the height of its efficiency and confidence, controlling vast territories with systematic thoroughness that made any form of resistance extremely dangerous and difficult to sustain. The network of contacts that he was tasked to establish and maintain included French citizens who risked not only their own lives, but the lives of their families by choosing to work with British agents. Men and women whose courage and dedication humbled Alfred, even as their vulnerability to betrayal and discovery created constant anxiety about their safety. The safe houses where he sheltered during his time in France were typically modest residences in unremarkable neighborhoods, chosen specifically for their ordinariness and the lack of attention they would attract from German patrols or French collaborators seeking to curry favor with the occupying authorities. The families who provided these refuges were ordinary people, transformed by extraordinary circumstances into heroes, whose quiet bravery enabled the larger resistance effort to function despite constant danger and occasional devastating losses. The missions that Alfred undertook during his months in France ranged from gathering intelligence about German military movements and installations to organizing sabotage operations that would disrupt enemy communications and transportation without provoking the kind of massive reprisals that could destroy entire communities in retaliation for resistance activities. The delicate balance between effective action and acceptable risk required constant judgment calls that tested not only his tactical skills, but his understanding of the larger strategic picture and the moral weight of decisions that affected people he had grown to know and care about. The close calls with capture that punctuated his time in occupied territory provided Alfred with experiences that would shape his understanding of courage and fear for the remainder of his life, teaching him that true bravery was not the absence of terror, but the ability to function effectively despite overwhelming anxiety about consequences that could include torture and execution. The techniques he learned for maintaining his cover identity under intense questioning, for providing plausible explanations for suspicious activities, for projecting calm confidence when every instinct screamed for flight or concealment, all became second nature through practice and necessity. The network of agents and resistance fighters with whom Alfred worked included individuals from every level of French society, from aristocrats whose estates provided meeting places and supply depots to laborers whose jobs gave them access to critical infrastructure and intelligence about German activities. The bonds that formed between these disparate individuals under the pressure of shared danger were unlike any relationships Alfred had previously experienced, characterized by absolute trust and mutual dependence that transcended the social boundaries that normally defined human interactions. Among his closest collaborators was Marie-Claire Dubois, a young woman whose position as a secretary in the local prefecture provided invaluable access to German administrative documents, while her quick intelligence and unshakable nerve made her one of the most effective operatives in the Fosdame entier network. Her ability to obtain and transmit crucial information without arousing suspicion was matched by her skill in organizing safe passage for escaping Allied airmen and refugees fleeing the increasingly oppressive German occupation, policiers. The relationship that developed between Alfred and Marie-Claire was complicated by the necessity of maintaining professional objectivity while working in circumstances that demanded absolute personal trust, creating emotional bonds that could not be safely acknowledged or explored, given the likelihood that either or both of them might be captured or killed at any moment. The intensity of shared danger and common purpose created a form of intimacy that was deeper than romance, yet more constrained than friendship, a connection that would endure in memory long after the war had ended and their paths had diverged. The intelligence that Alfred and his network gathered and transmitted to London contributed to Allied understanding of German defensive preparations and troop movements that would prove crucial in planning the eventual liberation campaigns, though the operatives themselves were rarely informed about how their information was being used or what impact their efforts were having on the larger course of the conflict. This ignorance was necessary for security reasons, but also psychologically demanding, requiring faith that their sacrifices and risks were serving purposes important enough to justify the terrible costs being paid by the resistance communities. The betrayal that eventually compromised Alfred's network came not from enemy detection or surveillance, but from within their own ranks, when a trusted member succumbed to pressure from German interrogators and revealed the identities and locations of his fellow operatives in exchange for promises of lenient treatment for his captured family. The speed with which the German security forces moved to roll up the entire organization demonstrated the efficiency of their intelligence operations, while also highlighting the vulnerability that was inherent in any resistance network, no matter how carefully organized or skillfully managed. The warning that reached Alfred came barely an hour before the Gestapo arrived at his safe house, providing just enough time for him to destroy his radio equipment and coding materials while escaping through a previously prepared route that led across rooftops and through narrow alleys to a secondary hiding place that had been established for exactly such emergencies. The sound of breaking glass and shouted orders in German that echoed through the neighborhood behind him served as grim confirmation that his former refuge was being thoroughly searched by men who would show no mercy to anyone found harboring British agents. The weeks that followed were a desperate game of cat and mouse as Alfred attempted to evade capture while making his way toward the Spanish border and eventual extraction by sea, moving only at night through countryside that swarmed with German patrols and French milice seeking to earn rewards for turning in fugitive agents. The skills in navigation and survival that had seemed merely academic during his training became matters of life and death as he foraged for food in abandoned gardens and slept in barns and caves while avoiding the roads and villages where his presence might be detected and reported. The Spanish border guards who initially detained Alfred were suspicious of his forged papers and inconsistent cover story, requiring several anxious days of questioning and verification before his true identity could be confirmed. Through channels that connected Madrid with London via circuitous routes designed to protect both Spanish neutrality and British intelligence operations. The relief he felt upon finally reaching safe territory was tempered by grief for the members of his network who had been captured and would face imprisonment, torture, or execution for their service to the Allied cause. The debriefing sessions that occupied his first weeks back in London were exhaustive examinations of every aspect of his time in occupied territory, conducted by intelligence officers who sought to extract every possible piece of information that might be useful for future operations, while also evaluating his performance and psychological condition to determine whether he was suitable for continued service in similar roles. The clinical nature of these interviews, treating experiences that had been intensely personal and traumatic as mere data to be catalogued and analyzed, provided Alfred with his first real understanding of how the intelligence services viewed their operatives as valuable but ultimately expendable resources. The medals and commendations that were awarded for his service in France were presented in private ceremonies that emphasized the continuing need for secrecy about his activities, recognition that could never be publicly acknowledged, but which represented his country's gratitude for sacrifices that few citizens would ever know had been made on their behalf. The satisfaction that came from having served effectively in desperate circumstances was tempered by sorrow for colleagues who had paid the ultimate price for their commitment to freedom and justice. The assignment to train new agents for operations in other theaters of the war provided Alfred with opportunities to pass on the hard-won knowledge and skills that might help future operatives avoid some of the dangers and mistakes that had claimed so many lives during the early years of the conflict. His ability to combine technical instruction with psychological preparation to help trainees understand not only how to perform their duties, but why their mission was worth the risks involved, made him an invaluable member of the training staff. The young men and women who came under his instruction represented a cross-section of British society, united by courage and determination to serve their country in ways that required extraordinary personal sacrifice. Individuals whose diverse backgrounds and motivations reminded Alfred of his own journey from comfortable domesticity to the deadly complexities of clandestine warfare. The responsibility he felt for preparing them as thoroughly as possible, knowing that their survival would depend upon how well he had taught them, added weight and meaning to every lesson and exercise. The operations that he planned and supervised from London headquarters involved coordinating with resistance networks across occupied Europe, providing support and direction for activities that ranged from intelligence gathering to sabotage missions that could cripple German military capabilities in specific regions. The map-covered walls of his office told stories of courage and sacrifice that could never be fully recorded in official histories, marking locations where brave individuals had given their lives to advance the cause of liberation. The moral complexities that Alfred encountered in his intelligence role forced him to confront questions about the relationship between ends and means that would influence his thinking for the remainder of his life. Situations where achieving strategically vital objectives required actions that violated peacetime moral standards, while failure to act might result in even greater suffering and injustice. The weight of making decisions that would determine who lived and who died, who would be sacrificed for the greater good and who would be saved, was a burden that few individuals could bear without lasting psychological consequences. The network of contacts and friendships that Alfred developed within the intelligence community during the war years would prove to be one of the most valuable legacies of his service. Connections that transcended national boundaries and institutional loyalties to create informal alliances based on mutual respect and shared experiences. These relationships would provide him with resources and support that could be called upon in future years when circumstances required access to information or assistance that could not be obtained through conventional channels. The end of the war brought with it a mixture of relief and uncertainty as Alfred contemplated his future in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by 6 years of global conflict, where the comfortable assumptions and established institutions of the pre-war era had been swept away and replaced by new realities that would define international relations for decades to come. The skills and experiences that had made him valuable to the intelligence services were not easily transferable to civilian occupations, while the knowledge of classified operations and sensitive information that he possessed created ongoing security obligations that would constrain his freedom of movement and association. The offer to remain with the intelligence services in a permanent capacity was both flattering and tempting, providing the opportunity for continued service in meaningful work, while maintaining the camaraderie and sense of purpose that had sustained him through the darkest years of the conflict. Yet the psychological toll of living constantly under assumed identities and false pretenses, of maintaining emotional distance from the very people he was trying to protect, had gradually eroded his capacity for the kind of normal human relationships that gave life meaning beyond professional achievement. The decision to decline permanent employment with the intelligence services was influenced not only by his desire to return to civilian life, but also by his growing understanding that the skills and qualities that had made him effective as an agent might be better employed in service that was more personal and direct, where the human connections that had been necessarily limited during his covert career could be developed and cherished without the constraints of security requirements and operational necessity. The transition from the shadowy world of espionage to whatever civilian career awaited him would prove to be more challenging than Alfred had anticipated, requiring him to relearn social skills that had been suppressed during his years of maintaining false identities while adapting to a peacetime world that seemed almost foreign after so many years of constant danger and moral ambiguity. The man who emerged from 6 years of secret service was fundamentally changed from the young theatrical aspirant who had answered his country's call, possessed of capabilities and knowledge that would serve him well in whatever challenges the future might bring. The transition from the shadowy corridors of wartime intelligence to the rigorous demands of elite military service represented for Alfred Pennyworth not an escape from danger, but rather a deliberate embrace of a different form of warfare, one that would test his physical capabilities and leadership potential in ways that his clandestine operations had never required. The Special Air Service, formed in the crucible of desert warfare and forged through the desperate necessity of unconventional tactics, had earned a reputation as the most demanding and selective military unit in the British Armed Forces, accepting only those individuals whose combination of physical prowess, mental toughness, and moral courage met standards that eliminated all but the most exceptional candidates. The recommendation for his transfer to the SAS came from Colonel Fairfax himself, who had observed Alfred's performance during the final months of the war with the kind of professional appreciation that recognized exceptional potential when properly channeled and developed. The skills that had made him valuable as an intelligence operative, his ability to operate independently under extreme pressure while maintaining precise judgment and unwavering dedication to mission objectives, were precisely the qualities that the SAS required in its personnel as the unit evolved from its wartime origins into a permanent component of Britain's military capabilities. The selection process that determined Alfred's suitability for SAS service was designed to push candidates beyond their perceived limitations, subjecting them to physical and psychological stresses that would reveal character flaws and weaknesses that might prove fatal in actual combat situations. The trials began with basic fitness assessments that seemed almost mundane in comparison to what would follow, establishing baseline measurements of strength, endurance, and coordination that would be systematically exceeded through months of progressively more demanding training. The Welsh mountains, where much of the selection process took place, provided a harsh and unforgiving environment that tested not only physical capabilities but mental resilience and determination in the face of conditions that would break the spirit of lesser men. The forced marches across terrain that seemed designed to punish human ambition, carrying equipment loads that increased with each stage of the program, separated those who possessed genuine commitment from those who had merely thought they wanted to join the elite ranks of special forces. Alfred's background in theatrical training proved unexpectedly valuable during the psychological evaluation phases of selection, as his ability to maintain emotional control while presenting different aspects of his personality allowed him to navigate the complex interviews and scenario-based tests that were designed to identify potential security risks or character flaws that might compromise operational effectiveness. The evaluators were impressed not only by his stability under pressure, but by his demonstrated capacity for making sound decisions when presented with morally ambiguous situations that had no clear right answers. The combat training that followed his successful completion of the selection process represented a quantum leap in intensity and complexity from anything he had previously experienced, even during his most dangerous intelligence operations. The weapons instruction covered not only conventional firearms but specialized equipment designed for specific tactical situations, from silent killing techniques that left no evidence of hostile action, to explosive devices that could disable enemy installations while minimizing collateral damage to civilian populations. The hand-to-hand combat training drew upon fighting techniques from around the world, combining elements of traditional martial arts with modern military combat systems to create a comprehensive approach to personal warfare that emphasized efficiency and adaptability over rigid adherence to specific forms or styles. Alfred discovered that his years of stage training had given him body awareness and control that accelerated his mastery of these skills, while his experience in actual life or death situations provided psychological preparation that many of his fellow trainees lacked. The medical training that formed an essential component of SAS preparation was far more extensive than the basic first aid that most soldiers received, encompassing field surgery techniques and trauma care procedures that could mean the difference between life and death when professional medical assistance was unavailable or hours away. Alfred's methodical approach to learning and his steady nerves under pressure made him particularly adept at these skills, earning recognition from medical instructors who noted his potential for serving as team medic on future operations. The survival training conducted in environments ranging from Arctic conditions to tropical jungles tested every aspect of physical and mental endurance. while teaching practical skills that could sustain life when conventional resources were unavailable. Alfred learned to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, to construct shelter using only natural materials, to identify edible plants and trap small animals for food, to navigate by celestial observations when compass and map were lost or unreliable. The psychological conditioning that accompanied this physical training was designed to prepare SAS personnel for the mental stresses of operating in isolation from normal command structures, making critical decisions without the luxury of consultation or second opinions, maintaining morale and effectiveness, even when missions extended far beyond their planned duration. The confidence that came from knowing he could survive and function effectively under the most adverse conditions would prove invaluable in situations where failure of nerve or judgment could result in mission failure and loss of life. The teamwork exercises that formed a crucial part of advanced training required Alfred to work closely with other SAS personnel in simulated combat situations that tested not only individual skills but the ability to function as part of a cohesive unit, where each member's actions affected the safety and success of his comrades. These exercises revealed leadership qualities that had remained largely undeveloped during his intelligence career, demonstrating his ability to inspire confidence and coordinate complex operations while maintaining the kind of calm authority that enabled others to perform at their best under pressure. The first operational assignment that followed Alfred's completion of SAS training took him to Malaya, where communist insurgents were conducting a guerrilla campaign against British colonial authorities, using tactics that conventional military units were struggling to counter effectively. The jungle environment presented challenges that were entirely different from the urban and rural settings where he had previously operated, requiring adaptation to conditions where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, and where the enemy's intimate knowledge of terrain provided significant advantages. The counter-insurgency operations that Alfred participated in during his tour in Malaya required a delicate balance between aggressive pursuit of hostile forces and careful protection of civilian populations whose support was essential for long-term success. The Hearts and Minds campaign that accompanied military action demanded understanding of local customs and languages that went far beyond the basic cultural briefings that most soldiers received, requiring genuine empathy and respect for people whose way of life was fundamentally different from anything in Alfred's previous experience. The small unit tactics that characterized SAS operations in the jungle environment played to Alfred's strengths as an independent operator, while also developing his abilities as a team leader responsible for the safety and effectiveness of men under his command. The patrols that he led deep into insurgent-controlled territory required planning and execution that left no room for error, where a single mistake in navigation or camouflage could result in ambush and annihilation of the entire team. The intelligence gathering that formed a major component of these jungle operations drew upon all of Alfred's previous experience, while also teaching him new techniques for collecting and analyzing information in environments where conventional sources were unavailable or unreliable. The reports that he compiled from these missions provided strategic commanders with detailed understanding of insurgent capabilities and intentions that proved crucial in planning larger operations designed to disrupt their activities. The relationships that Alfred formed with indigenous guides and informants during his time in Malaya provided him with insights into cultural dynamics and political complexities that would influence his worldview for the remainder of his life. These men risked their lives and those of their families by cooperating with British forces, motivated not by monetary rewards but by genuine belief that the communist insurgency represented a greater threat to their communities than continued colonial administration. The combat actions that punctuated months of careful surveillance and intelligence gathering tested Alfred's abilities as both soldier and leader in situations where split-second decisions determined the difference between successful completion of missions and catastrophic failure that could compromise entire operational areas. The firefights that erupted when patrols encountered insurgent forces were brief but intense affairs where superior training and equipment were balanced against enemy advantages in numbers and terrain knowledge. The decorations that Alfred earned during his service in Malaya were recognition of leadership and courage that had been demonstrated repeatedly under conditions where failure of nerve or judgment could have resulted in the deaths of men under his command. The citations that accompanied these awards spoke of actions that could not be described in detail for security reasons, but which had contributed significantly to the overall success of counterinsurgency operations in his assigned area. The transfer to Cyprus that followed his successful tour in Malaya represented a different type of challenge, as ethnic tensions between Greek and Turkish populations created a complex political environment where military action had to be carefully calibrated to avoid inflaming communal conflicts that could spiral into widespread civil war. The terrorist activities conducted by Ioka guerrillas required responses that were both effective in neutralizing immediate threats and sensitive to the broader political implications of British military action. The urban warfare skills that Alfred developed during counter-terrorism operations in Cyprus would prove invaluable in future assignments, as the narrow streets and crowded neighborhoods where insurgents sought refuge demanded tactics that were fundamentally different from jungle warfare or conventional battlefield operations. The need to minimize civilian casualties while pursuing determined and well-armed opponents required precision and restraint that tested every aspect of his training and experience. The interrogation techniques that Alfred learned during his Cyprus assignment were more sophisticated than anything he had previously encountered, designed to extract information from captured terrorists while complying with legal and moral standards that distinguished legitimate military operations from the brutal methods employed by some colonial authorities. His background in psychology and human behavior, developed through years of intelligence, work, and theatrical training, made him particularly effective in these roles. The leadership responsibilities that Alfred assumed during his final years of SAS service included training new recruits and planning operations that would be executed by teams under his command, roles that required him to balance competing demands of mission effectiveness and personnel safety while maintaining the high standards that defined SAS performance. The junior officers who served under him consistently praised his ability to prepare them thoroughly for dangerous assignments, while also providing the kind of personal support that enabled them to function effectively under extreme stress. The incident that ultimately led to Alfred's retirement from active SAS service occurred during a classified operation in the Arabian Peninsula, where political sensitivities and extreme environmental conditions combined to create challenges that tested every aspect of his accumulated skills and experience. The mission itself was successful in achieving its strategic objectives, but the costs in human terms were higher than anticipated, resulting in casualties that weighed heavily on Alfred's conscience despite official recognition that the operation had been planned and executed according to the highest professional standards. The psychological evaluation that followed this final operation identified stress indicators that suggested Alfred had reached the limits of his capacity for active service in high-risk assignments, not through any failure of courage or competence, but through the accumulated weight of years spent in situations where death was a constant companion and moral compromises were routine necessities. The recommendation for transfer to training and administrative duties was presented as recognition of his value as an instructor and mentor, rather than as evidence of declining capabilities. The decision to leave active service rather than accept assignment to a staff position was influenced by Alfred's growing recognition that his years of military service had given him skills and perspectives that might be better employed in civilian life, where the lessons he had learned about leadership, planning, and crisis management could be applied to challenges that did not require the constant potential for violence that characterized Special Forces operations. The pension and benefits that came with his honorable discharge provided financial security that would enable him to choose his future employment based on personal satisfaction rather than economic necessity. The network of contacts and friendships that Alfred had developed during his SAS years extended throughout the military and intelligence communities, creating informal alliances that would prove invaluable in future years when circumstances required access to specialized knowledge or assistance that could not be obtained through conventional channels. The respect that he had earned from colleagues and subordinates alike provided him with a reputation that would open doors and create opportunities in whatever civilian career he chose to pursue. The transition from elite military service to civilian life represented a fundamental shift in identity and purpose that required Alfred to reconsider his fundamental assumptions about duty, service, and the meaning of a life well lived. The skills and experiences that had defined his military career were not easily transferable to peacetime occupations, while the intensity and camaraderie that characterized SAS service were impossible to replicate in civilian environments where life or death decisions were rare, and the bonds between colleagues were based on professional cooperation rather than absolute mutual dependence. The psychological adjustment to civilian life was complicated by the classified nature of much of Alfred's military service, which prevented him from sharing his experiences or receiving recognition for achievements that had required extraordinary courage and sacrifice. The isolation that resulted from this enforced secrecy was balanced by the satisfaction that came from knowing he had served his country faithfully in roles that few citizens would ever understand or appreciate. The search for meaningful civilian employment led Alfred to consider opportunities that would allow him to use his organizational and leadership skills, while also providing the kind of personal satisfaction that had drawn him to service in the first place. The prospect of returning to traditional domestic service, which had once seemed like a step backward from his military achievements, began to appear in a different light as he contemplated the possibility of finding fulfillment through dedication to individuals and families, rather than abstract concepts of national interest or strategic objectives. The man who emerged from 8 years of SAS service was fundamentally different from the intelligence operative who had sought new challenges after the war, possessed of capabilities and perspectives that would enable him to handle whatever challenges civilian life might present, while also carrying the invisible scars that marked all those who had spent their youth and young adulthood in service to causes that demanded everything while promising nothing except the opportunity to serve with honor and distinction. The letter that arrived at Alfred's modest London flat in the spring of 1952 bore the distinctive watermark and elegant script that marked correspondence from the highest echelons of American society, yet its contents were so unexpected and intriguing that he read it 3 times before fully comprehending the extraordinary opportunity that was being presented to him. The Wayne family of Gotham City, whose industrial empire and philanthropic endeavors had made them legendary figures in American society, was seeking a gentleman's gentleman, whose qualifications extended far beyond the traditional requirements of domestic service into realms that few employers would ever have reason to consider. Dr. Thomas Wayne's initial inquiry had been prompted by recommendations from mutual acquaintances in the intelligence community, who spoke of Alfred's unique combination of traditional service training, military experience, and personal qualities that made him ideally suited for a position that would require both impeccable domestic management and the ability to handle situations that might arise from the Wayne family's prominent position in American society and their various business and philanthropic interests that sometimes attracted unwanted attention from less savory elements. The interview that followed this correspondence took place not in Gotham City but in London itself, where Thomas Wayne was attending a medical conference that provided convenient cover for their meeting, while also demonstrating the global scope of his professional interests and commitments. The restaurant he chose for their initial conversation was quietly elegant rather than ostentatious, reflecting the understated sophistication that would characterize all of Alfred's subsequent interactions with the Wayne family patriarch. Dr. Wayne's appearance and demeanor immediately impressed Alfred as representing the finest qualities of American leadership and achievement, combining the confidence and directness that seemed characteristic of successful Americans with the kind of intellectual depth and moral seriousness that marked truly exceptional individuals, regardless of their nationality. His questions during their conversation revealed not only thorough preparation regarding Alfred's background, but also genuine interest in understanding his motivations and aspirations, rather than simply verifying his qualifications. The position that Thomas Wayne described during their lengthy discussion was unlike any traditional domestic service role that Alfred had ever encountered, requiring someone who could manage not only the conventional aspects of household administration, but also serve as confidential assistant for matters that touched upon business, politics, and philanthropic activities that sometimes required absolute discretion and occasionally involved personal risks that went far beyond the normal hazards of domestic employment. The Wayne family's situation, as Thomas Wayne carefully explained it, involved unique challenges that arose from their prominent position in Gotham City's social and economic hierarchy, their extensive involvement in civic and charitable organizations, and their commitment to using their wealth and influence in ways that sometimes created opposition from individuals and organizations whose interests were threatened by reform efforts and anti-corruption campaigns that the Waynes actively supported. The compensation package that accompanied this position was generous beyond anything that Alfred might have expected, reflecting not only the demanding nature of the responsibilities involved, but also Thomas Wayne's understanding that exceptional service required exceptional recognition and that loyalty and discretion of the highest order could not be secured through ordinary employment arrangements. The salary alone would have been sufficient to attract qualified candidates, but the additional benefits and the promise of genuine partnership in meaningful work made the offer irresistibly appealing. The decision to accept Thomas Wayne's offer required Alfred to consider not only the professional opportunities it presented, but also the personal implications of relocating to America and adapting to a culture and society that were fundamentally different from anything in his previous experience. The prospect of beginning an entirely new phase of his career in a country where his background and achievements would be largely unknown represented both challenge and liberation, offering the chance to reinvent himself while applying everything he had learned during his years of service in various capacities. The voyage to America aboard the Queen Mary provided Alfred with time to prepare mentally and emotionally for the transition that awaited him, while also offering opportunities to observe and learn from his fellow passengers, many of whom were Americans returning from European business or pleasure trips, whose conversations and behaviors provided insights into the cultural expectations and social dynamics that would define his new environment. The arrival at Wayne Manor in late summer of 1952 marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most significant and enduring phase of Alfred's entire career, though he could not have anticipated at the time how profoundly this position would transform not only his professional life, but his fundamental understanding of service, loyalty, and the meaning of family bonds that transcend the traditional boundaries between employer and employee. The manor itself exceeded even Alfred's considerable expectations, representing a masterpiece of American domestic architecture that combined the grandeur and elegance of European palatial design with innovations and amenities that reflected the technological advancement and practical sensibility that characterized the best of American achievement. The grounds surrounding the main residence were meticulously maintained, yet designed to appear naturally beautiful, creating an environment of pastoral tranquility that provided refuge from the demands and pressures of Thomas Wayne's professional and civic responsibilities. The household staff that Alfred inherited and would be expected to manage consisted of experienced professionals who had served the Wayne family for years and who possessed intimate knowledge of their preferences, habits, and expectations that could not be learned from any manual or training program. The challenge of earning their respect and cooperation while implementing any necessary improvements or changes required all of Alfred's diplomatic skills and understanding of human nature, developed through years of working with diverse groups of people under challenging circumstances. Mrs. Chilton, the head cook who had presided over the Wayne kitchen for nearly 2 decades, represented the kind of institutional memory and practical wisdom that made her invaluable to the smooth operation of the household, while also making her potentially resistant to any suggestions for modification of established routines. Her initial skepticism about the new butler's qualifications and intentions was gradually overcome through Alfred's demonstration of genuine respect for her expertise and his willingness to learn from her experience rather than attempting to impose changes based purely on theoretical knowledge. The gardening staff, led by old Samuel, who had maintained the grounds since Thomas Wayne's childhood, possessed similar depths of knowledge and emotional investment in their work that required careful handling and appreciation. Alfred's recognition of their contributions and his efforts to support their work with improved resources and equipment earned their loyalty, while also enhancing the beauty and functionality of the estate in ways that pleased the Port family and reflected well on his management capabilities. The security considerations that were an integral part of managing the Wayne household required Alfred to draw upon his military and intelligence background in ways that were never explicitly acknowledged, but which were clearly appreciated by Thomas Wayne, whose position and activities sometimes attracted attention from individuals whose intentions were not entirely benign. The discreet modifications that Alfred implemented to improve the manor's defensive capabilities and emergency procedures reflected his understanding that true security was achieved through preparation and vigilance rather than obvious displays of protective measures. The relationship that developed between Alfred and young Bruce Wayne, then 8 years old, was perhaps the most unexpectedly rewarding aspect of his new position, as the boy's intelligence and curiosity reminded him of his own childhood, while also presenting unique challenges that required patience and creativity to address effectively. Bruce's precocious understanding of adult concerns and his tendency to ask probing questions about subjects that others might prefer to avoid demanded responses that were honest yet age-appropriate, requiring Alfred to balance truthfulness with protection of childhood innocence. The educational support that Alfred provided to Bruce extended far beyond the formal tutoring that supplemented his regular schooling to encompass the kind of practical knowledge and moral guidance that could only be transmitted through daily interaction and example. The walks through the estate, during which Alfred shared his observations about nature, history, and human behavior, became cherished opportunities for both teacher and student to explore ideas and develop the kind of mutual respect and affection that would endure throughout their lives. Martha Wayne's immediate acceptance of Alfred as not merely a household employee, but as a trusted confidant and advisor, reflected her remarkable ability to recognize and appreciate exceptional qualities in others, while also demonstrating the kind of gracious leadership that made the Wayne household a genuinely pleasant place to work. Her requests for his assistance with her various charitable and social obligations provided opportunities for Alfred to contribute his organizational skills and cultural knowledge to causes that aligned with his own values and interests. The dinner parties and social gatherings that the Waynes hosted as part of their civic and business responsibilities required coordination and execution that tested every aspect of Alfred's training and experience, as these events often brought together individuals with conflicting interests and personalities whose interactions required careful management to ensure successful outcomes. The diplomatic skills that he had developed during his military and intelligence careers proved invaluable in navigating these complex social dynamics while maintaining the kind of elegant atmosphere that enhanced the Wayne family's brush and beard reputation for gracious hospitality. The business meetings that occasionally took place at the manor required Alfred to provide support that went beyond simple refreshment service to encompass understanding of confidential matters and the ability to facilitate communications that might affect significant financial and political decisions. Thomas Wayne's trust in Alfred's discretion and judgment grew steadily as these situations demonstrated his reliability and his commitment to serving the family's interests with absolute loyalty. The charitable work that occupied much of Martha Wayne's time and energy provided Alfred with insights into the social problems and civic challenges that faced Gotham City, while also demonstrating the genuine compassion and commitment to social justice that motivated the Wayne family's philanthropic activities. The organizational support that he provided for these efforts allowed him to contribute directly to causes that addressed poverty, education, and healthcare needs that affected the most vulnerable members of the community. The medical emergencies that occasionally arose in the household, given Thomas Wayne's profession and his tendency to provide assistance to anyone in need, regardless of their ability to pay, allowed Alfred to utilize his military medical training in ways that proved invaluable in saving lives and providing care until professional help could arrive. These situations demonstrated to the Wayne family that their butler possessed capabilities that extended far beyond traditional domestic service into areas that could prove crucial in crisis situations. The security threats that sometimes materialized as a result of Thomas Wayne's reform efforts and anti-corruption activities required Alfred to implement protective measures and emergency procedures that drew heavily upon his military experience, while remaining invisible to family members and guests who should not be burdened with awareness of potential dangers. The balance between adequate protection and normal family life required constant vigilance and careful judgment about when to alert the family to risks and when to handle situations discreetly. The community of Wayne Manor staff that Alfred gradually molded into a highly efficient and loyal team reflected his understanding that exceptional service required not only individual competence, but also cohesive cooperation among all household employees, each of whom played a crucial role in maintaining the standards of excellence that the Wayne family deserved and expected. The respect and affection that he earned from these colleagues created an atmosphere of mutual support and shared pride in their collective achievements. The seasonal rhythms of life at Wayne Manor, from elaborate Christmas celebrations that honored family traditions, while also acknowledging the cultural diversity of staff and guests to summer garden parties that showcased the beauty of the estate while raising funds for worthy causes, provided Alfred with opportunities to demonstrate his creativity and organizational skills, while also contributing to the creation of memories that would be treasured by all who participated in these special occasions. The gradual expansion of Alfred's responsibilities to include oversight of the Wayne family's other properties and business interests reflected Thomas Wayne's growing confidence in his judgment and capabilities, while also providing opportunities for professional growth and development that kept his work interesting and challenging, even as his mastery of traditional household management became complete and routine. The premonitions of danger that began to trouble Alfred's sleep during the winter of 1959 were based not on any specific intelligence or concrete threats, but rather on the intuitive understanding of human nature and social dynamics that had been developed through years of experience in situations where the stakes were life and death. The increasing boldness of criminal elements in Gotham City, combined with the Wayne family's high profile and reform activities, created a combination of factors that his trained instincts recognized as potentially catastrophic. The attempts to convince Thomas Wayne to accept additional security measures or modify his routines to reduce exposure to potential threats were met with the kind of principled resistance that Alfred had come to admire, even as it frustrated his protective instincts, as the doctor refused to allow fear or caution to prevent him from fulfilling his obligations to his patients and his community. The compromise solutions that they eventually agreed upon provided some additional protection, while allowing Thomas Wayne to maintain the accessibility and openness that were essential to his effectiveness as both physician and civic leader. The night that would change everything forever began like so many others, with the Wayne family preparing to attend a social event that combined entertainment with fundraising for one of Martha Wayne's favorite charities, an evening at the theater that promised to be both enjoyable and productive in advancing causes that they all supported. Alfred's final preparations for their departure included the usual security briefing and emergency procedures, precautions that had become routine, yet retained their importance despite the family's desire to maintain as normal a life as possible. The decision to remain at the manor that evening, rather than accompanying the family as he sometimes did, was based on practical considerations regarding household management and security, though Alfred would spend the rest of his life wondering whether his presence might have made a difference in the events that followed. The quiet evening he anticipated spending on administrative tasks and planning for upcoming events was shattered by a telephone call that would mark the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another that he could never have imagined. The evening of June 26, 1959, had begun with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of Alfred's preparations when the Wayne family attended public functions, each element of their departure choreographed with the precision that ensured both elegance and security, while maintaining the appearance of effortless grace that had become synonymous with the Wayne name throughout Gotham City. The weather had been unseasonably cool for late June, prompting Martha Wayne to select the pearl grey evening coat that complemented her sapphire necklace, while Thomas Wayne chose his favorite dress watch, a wedding gift from his father that he wore only on occasions of particular significance. Young Bruce, now 8 years old and increasingly aware of the social importance of such events, had been disappointed to learn that this particular evening was designated as an adults-only affair, though Alfred had promised him a detailed account of the theatrical performance and permission to stay up past his usual bedtime to hear about the evening's events when his parents returned. The boy's fascination with his father's work and his growing understanding of the family's role in the community had made these debriefing sessions a cherished tradition that strengthened the bonds between parent and child, while also providing Bruce with insights into the complexities of adult responsibility. The Monarch Theatre, where the Waynes were to attend a benefit performance of The Mark of Zorro, represented one of Gotham City's most prestigious cultural institutions, a venue where the city's elite regularly gathered to support the arts, while also conducting the kind of informal business and social networking that shaped the community's political and economic landscape. The choice of entertainment was particularly appropriate given the Wayne family's long-standing commitment to supporting theatrical productions that combined popular appeal with artistic merit, reflecting their belief that culture should be accessible to all citizens, rather than remaining the exclusive province of the wealthy. Alfred's decision to remain at Wayne Manor that evening had been influenced by several practical considerations that, in retrospect, would torment him with questions about what might have been different if he had chosen otherwise. The household accounts required attention that had been delayed by recent social obligations, while the planning for Bruce's upcoming 9th birthday celebration demanded coordination with caterers and entertainers that could only be accomplished during evening hours when these vendors were available for extended consultations. The security assessment that Alfred conducted as part of his regular evening routine had revealed nothing unusual or concerning, with all electronic systems functioning normally and the groundskeeping staff reporting no suspicious activities or unexpected visitors during their daily maintenance rounds. The discreet network of contacts throughout Gotham City, who occasionally provided information about potential threats to prominent families, had offered no warnings or suggestions for increased vigilance, creating an atmosphere of routine normalcy that masked the approaching catastrophe. The telephone call that shattered the peaceful quiet of Wayne Manor at 11:47 that night came not from the expected source of Thomas Wayne's medical service or Martha Wayne's charitable contacts, but from Detective Harvey Bullock of the Gotham City Police Department, whose gruff voice carried a weight of sorrow and professional duty that immediately conveyed the magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen the family Alfred served with such devotion. The words that Detective Bullock spoke during that brief and devastating conversation would echo in Alfred's memory for the remainder of his life, their simple declarative statements containing implications so profound that his mind initially rejected their reality, even as his training and experience forced him to begin processing their immediate practical consequences. The Wayne family had been the victims of an armed robbery that had escalated into violence, resulting in the deaths of both Thomas and Martha Wayne, while leaving young Bruce physically unharmed but psychologically traumatized in ways that would require immediate and ongoing attention. The location where the tragedy had occurred was Park Row, the narrow alley that connected the theatre district to the more fashionable shopping areas, where the Waynes had apparently decided to walk rather than wait for their driver to navigate the post-performance traffic that regularly congested the streets around major cultural venues. The decision to take this route, which the family had used safely on numerous previous occasions, had placed them in the path of a desperate criminal whose intentions had escalated from simple theft to murderous violence when Thomas Wayne had attempted to protect his wife and son. Alfred's immediate response to this devastating news drew upon every aspect of his military and intelligence training, suppressing the emotional shock and grief that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought, while focusing on the urgent practical needs that required immediate attention. The first priority was ensuring Bruce's safety and well-being, which meant coordinating with the police authorities to arrange for the boy's immediate care, while also beginning the process of activating the emergency procedures that had been established to protect the Wayne family interests. In the event of such a catastrophe, the drive to Gotham City Police headquarters through streets that seemed transformed by the knowledge of what had occurred there represented one of the longest journeys of Alfred's life, each familiar landmark now invested with new and terrible significance. As he contemplated the magnitude of the changes that would reshape every aspect of his existence, the radio news reports that were already beginning to spread word of the tragedy throughout the city spoke of the loss to the community, while barely hinting at the personal devastation that had been visited upon a small boy whose entire world had been destroyed in a matter of minutes. The police station where Bruce was waiting represented a harsh and alien environment for a child who had known only comfort and security throughout his privileged upbringing. Yet Alfred was struck by the composure that the boy maintained despite the traumatic circumstances that had brought him to this place. The blanket wrapped around his small shoulders and the untouched cup of hot chocolate on the table beside him spoke of well-intentioned efforts to provide comfort that could not begin to address the profound psychological wounds that had been inflicted upon his young psyche. The moment when Bruce looked up to see Alfred entering the interview room would remain burned into memory as one of the most heartbreaking sights that either man would ever witness. The recognition and relief in the child's eyes immediately followed by the crushing weight of shared grief, as they acknowledged together the reality of their mutual loss. The embrace that followed required no words, communicating through simple physical contact, the promise of continued protection, and the commitment to face together whatever challenges lay ahead. Detective Bullock's briefing regarding the circumstances of the crime provided few details that offered any comfort or explanation that might help make sense of the senseless violence that had claimed two of Gotham City's most prominent and beloved citizens. The perpetrator had been identified as Joe Chill, a small-time criminal whose desperate circumstances had apparently driven him to attempt a robbery that had escalated far beyond his original intentions when Thomas Wayne had attempted to protect his family from harm. The investigation that was already underway would eventually reveal the complex chain of circumstances that had led to this tragedy, from Joe Chill's mounting debts to gambling interests that had threatened his life, if not quickly satisfied, to his increasing desperation that had finally driven him to attempt the street crime that had seemed like a solution to his problems, but had instead created devastation that extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass an entire community that mourned the loss of two exceptional individuals. The immediate practical arrangements that required Alfred's attention during those first terrible hours involved coordinating with hospital officials regarding the release of the bodies, consulting with funeral directors about services that would honor the Wayne family's position in the community, while also respecting their desire for dignity and restraint, and beginning the complex process of notifying friends and colleagues throughout the world who needed to learn of the tragedy through personal communication rather than impersonal news reports. The Wayne family attorney, Philip Kane, who had served as legal counsel and trusted advisor for more than 2 decades, arrived at police headquarters within an hour of being notified, bringing with him the sealed documents that contained Thomas Wayne's detailed instructions for the care and education of his son in the event of his death. The provisions that had been made for Bruce's future reflected both loving concern for his well-being and practical recognition of the unique challenges that would face a child inheriting such vast responsibilities at such a young age. The legal guardianship arrangements that Thomas Wayne had established named Alfred as Bruce's primary caretaker, a decision that reflected not only professional respect for his capabilities, but personal trust that transcended the traditional boundaries between employer and employee, to acknowledge the genuine affection and loyalty that had developed during their years of association. The financial provisions that accompanied this responsibility ensured that Alfred would have the resources necessary to provide Bruce with every advantage while also maintaining the Wayne family properties and business interests until the Wayne boy reached maturity. The return journey to Wayne Manor, in the early hours of the morning, took place in the kind of profound silence that words could not adequately fill, as both Alfred and Bruce struggled to process the magnitude of the changes that would reshape their lives, while also beginning to confront the practical realities of continuing to exist in a world that had been fundamentally altered by their shared loss. The familiar sights of the estate grounds and the manor house itself seemed both comforting and alien, representing continuity with the past, while also serving as constant reminders of the absence that would define their future. The household staff who had waited throughout the night for news of the family's fate received confirmation of their worst fears with the kind of stoic acceptance that characterized their professional dedication, yet their grief was genuine and profound as they contemplated the loss of employers who had treated them with respect and consideration that exceeded anything they had experienced in previous positions. Mrs. Chilton's tears, as she prepared a simple meal that neither Alfred nor Bruce would be able to eat, reflected the emotional investment that all the staff had made in the Wayne family's welfare. The bedroom where Bruce would attempt to find sleep during his first night as an orphan had been prepared with the same attention to detail that characterized all aspects of household management, yet no amount of care could address the psychological trauma that would make rest nearly impossible during the weeks and months that followed. Alfred's decision to remain nearby throughout that first terrible night represented the beginning of a vigil that would extend in various forms throughout Bruce's childhood and adolescence as the boy struggled to come to terms with his loss. The telephone calls that continued throughout the following days brought expressions of sympathy and offers of assistance from around the world, as news of the Wayne family tragedy spread through networks of business associates, medical colleagues, and charitable organizations that had been touched by Thomas and Martha Wayne's generosity and commitment to social justice. The genuine sorrow expressed by these callers provided some comfort, while also serving as testimony to the positive impact that the deceased couple had made during their 2 brief lives. The funeral arrangements that Alfred coordinated during the week following the tragedy required balancing the Wayne family's preference for privacy and dignity with the community's need to express its grief and pay tribute to 2 individuals who had contributed so significantly to Gotham City's welfare and reputation. The compromise that emerged involved a private family service at Wayne Manor, followed by a public memorial at Gotham Cathedral that would allow the broader community to participate in honoring the deceased while protecting Bruce from excessive public attention during his most vulnerable period. The will reading that took place in the familiar surroundings of Thomas Wayne's study revealed the full extent of the provisions that had been made for Bruce's future, including detailed instructions regarding his education, the management of the family business interests, and the continuation of the philanthropic activities that had been so important to both parents. The appointment of a board of trustees to oversee these responsibilities during Bruce's minority years reflected Thomas Wayne's understanding that no single individual, however capable, could adequately manage all aspects of such a complex inheritance. The decision by several prominent families to offer Bruce a home with their own children was motivated by genuine concern for his welfare and recognition that the isolation of Wayne Manor might not provide the best environment for a grieving child. Yet, Alfred's gentle but firm resistance to these suggestions reflected his commitment to honoring Thomas Wayne's explicit wishes, while also protecting Bruce from further disruption during his period of adjustment to his new circumstances. The establishment of new routines and schedules that would provide structure and stability for Bruce's daily life required careful consideration of his psychological needs, while also maintaining the educational and social development that his parents would have wanted him to continue. The private tutors and counselors who were engaged to support his recovery and growth represented the finest professionals available, yet their effectiveness would ultimately depend upon Bruce's own resilience and his willingness to accept the help that was being offered. The nights that proved most difficult for both Alfred and Bruce were those when the silence of the manor seemed to emphasize the absence of voices and laughter that had once filled its rooms with warmth and life, creating an atmosphere of emptiness that no amount of activity or distraction could entirely dispel. The development of bedtime rituals that included reading and quiet conversation helped to create islands of comfort within the vast ocean of grief that surrounded their daily existence. The gradual emergence of Bruce's personality from the shell-shocked withdrawal of his first weeks as an orphan revealed both the resilience that would eventually enable him to overcome his trauma and the darker currents of anger and determination that would shape his future development in ways that Alfred could not entirely predict or control. The questions that the boy asked about justice, law enforcement, and the nature of evil reflected his struggle to understand how such senseless violence could exist in a world that had previously seemed safe and comprehensible. The promise that Alfred made to himself during those early days of adjustment was simple yet profound in its implications for both their futures. He would dedicate the remainder of his life to ensuring that Bruce Wayne grew into the kind of man that his parents would have been proud to acknowledge, regardless of the personal sacrifices that such commitment might require. This promise, made in the depths of shared grief, would prove to be the foundation upon which both their destinies would be built. The transformation of their relationship from that of employer and employee to something approaching that of father and son was neither sudden nor complete, but evolved gradually through countless small interactions and shared experiences that created bonds of affection and mutual dependence that transcended the formal arrangements that governed their legal connection. The love that grew between them would prove to be one of the few sources of light in the darkness that had descended upon Wayne Manor with the deaths of Thomas and Martha Wayne. The night that had begun with anticipation of cultural entertainment and charitable fundraising had ended with the destruction of one family and the creation of another, bound together, not by blood, but by shared loss, a mutual commitment to honor the memory of those who had been taken from them too soon. The man who had arrived at Wayne Manor as a butler would emerge from this tragedy, transformed into something far more significant, the guardian of both a child and a legacy that would shape not only their own futures, but the destiny of an entire city. The years that followed the Wayne family tragedy were marked not by any sudden transformation of Bruce into the brooding figure he would eventually become, but rather by a gradual evolution that unfolded through countless small moments and quiet conversations, each one contributing to the complex psychological architecture that would ultimately support both his remarkable achievements and his deepest struggles. Alfred's approach to raising this profoundly wounded child drew upon every aspect of his varied experience, while also requiring him to develop entirely new capabilities as surrogate parent, teacher, confidant, and guardian of a legacy that extended far beyond the considerable material inheritance that Bruce had received from his parents. The establishment of new daily routines during those first months after the tragedy required delicate balance between providing the structure and stability that Bruce desperately needed, while also allowing sufficient flexibility to accommodate his unpredictable emotional responses and the various therapeutic interventions that had been recommended by the child psychologists and grief counselors who were working to help him process his trauma. The schedule that eventually emerged incorporated traditional academic instruction with physical activities, creative pursuits, and carefully supervised social interactions, designed to prevent the kind of complete isolation that might have permanently damaged his ability to form healthy relationships. The breakfast conversations that became a cornerstone of their shared daily experience provided Alfred with opportunities to assess Bruce's emotional state, while also engaging in the kind of gentle, intellectual discourse that stimulated the boy's remarkable mind without overwhelming him with demands that exceeded his current capacity for sustained concentration. These morning discussions ranged across subjects as diverse as history and science, literature and philosophy, often sparked by something Bruce had read during his extensive evening explorations of his father's library, or questions prompted by dreams that reflected his ongoing struggle to understand the violence that had shattered his world. The educational approach that Alfred developed for Bruce's intellectual development was necessarily unconventional, combining the finest private tutors that money could secure with his own extensive knowledge, gained through years of diverse experience in fields that no traditional pedagogy could encompass. The language instruction that Bruce received went far beyond the French and Latin that were standard components of elite education, to include practical facility in German, Italian, and Spanish, skills that Alfred presented as natural extensions of their household's international connections, while privately recognizing that such linguistic capabilities might prove valuable in ways that he preferred not to contemplate too deeply. The physical training that formed an increasingly important component of Bruce's development was introduced gradually and presented as natural extensions of traditional English, gentlemanly accomplishments, beginning with riding lessons that helped develop balance and coordination, while also providing therapeutic interaction with animals whose uncomplicated affection offered emotional comfort that human relationships could not always provide. The swimming instruction that took place in the manor's indoor pool was framed as essential life skill, while also serving as excellent foundation for the more demanding physical conditioning that would follow in subsequent years. The martial arts training that Alfred began incorporating into Bruce's routine drew upon his own military experience and the combat skills he had acquired during his years with the Special Air Service, though he was careful to present these lessons as cultural education rather than preparation for violence. The discipline and mental focus required for proper execution of martial arts techniques provided Bruce with constructive outlets for his anger and frustration, while also beginning to develop the kind of physical capabilities that would eventually serve him in ways that Alfred could anticipate, but hoped would never become necessary. The moral and ethical discussions that occupied many of their evening conversations represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of Bruce's education. As Alfred worked to instill principles of justice and compassion, while also helping the boy grapple with questions about the nature of evil and the appropriate responses to crime and corruption that his parents' deaths had forced him to confront at far too young an age. These conversations required extraordinary sensitivity, as Alfred sought to nurture Bruce's natural empathy and sense of responsibility while preventing his grief and anger from calcifying into the kind of bitter cynicism that could destroy his capacity for happiness and healthy relationships. The introduction of Bruce to the family's business and philanthropic interests was handled with equal care, as Alfred recognized that the boy's inheritance included not only vast wealth, but also the obligation to use that wealth responsibly in service of the community that his parents had worked so hard to improve. The visits to Wayne Enterprises' facilities and meetings with the Board of Trustees were educational experiences that provided Bruce with understanding of how his family's resources could be deployed to address social problems, while also beginning to prepare him for the leadership responsibilities he would eventually assume. The seasonal celebrations that Alfred orchestrated during Bruce's childhood represented attempts to maintain some semblance of normal family life, despite the profound abnormality of their circumstances, creating new traditions that honored the memory of Thomas and Martha Wayne, while also acknowledging the unique needs of their altered household. The Christmas celebrations that filled Wayne Manor with carefully chosen decorations and thoughtfully selected gifts were designed to provide joy and wonder while avoiding the kind of excessive materialism that might distort Bruce's understanding of the values his parents had tried to instill. The summer activities that took them away from Gotham City provided opportunities for experiences that could not be replicated within the confines of even the most luxurious urban estate. From camping expeditions that taught practical skills and self-reliance to cultural tours of European cities that broadened Bruce's understanding of history and human achievement, while also exposing him to different ways of thinking about social organization and individual responsibility. The gradual realization of Bruce's intended path began to manifest itself, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of preferences and interests that revealed the direction of his developing obsessions, as his fascination with criminal justice and law enforcement grew beyond normal childhood curiosity to become something approaching a consuming passion that colored his interpretation of virtually every experience and learning opportunity. The books that Bruce chose to read during his extensive periods of solitary study reflected this growing fixation as he moved from age-appropriate adventure stories to increasingly sophisticated works on criminology, forensic science, and legal theory that would have challenged college students, while somehow seeming perfectly natural choices for a boy whose parents had been murdered by a common street criminal. Alfred's attempts to encourage broader literary interests met with limited success, though he was pleased to note that Bruce retained his appreciation for classical literature and poetry that provided some counterbalance to his darker preoccupations. The questions that Bruce asked about police procedures and judicial processes revealed not only his remarkable analytical intelligence, but also his growing frustration with what he perceived as the inadequacies and limitations of conventional law enforcement approaches to crime prevention and criminal justice. These discussions allowed Alfred to provide insights drawn from his own experience, while also attempting to moderate Bruce's increasingly critical assessment of social institutions that he viewed as having failed his parents and countless other victims of criminal violence. The visits to Crime Alley that Bruce insisted upon making, despite Alfred's concerns about both physical safety and psychological well-being, represented early manifestations of the kind of dangerous behavior that would characterize much of his adult life, as he seemed compelled to confront directly the location and circumstances of his parents' deaths, rather than allowing time and distance to heal his emotional wounds. Alfred's decision to accompany him on these painful pilgrimages reflected his understanding that attempting to forbid such activities would only drive Bruce to pursue them secretly, while his presence provided at least some measure of protection and emotional support. The relationship between Bruce and his few childhood friends was complicated by the vast differences in their life experiences and circumstances, as it proved nearly impossible for him to relate to peers whose primary concerns involved normal childhood issues rather than questions of justice, mortality, and the proper response to evil in the world. The birthday parties and social gatherings that Alfred arranged were well-intentioned attempts to provide normal childhood experiences, but they often highlighted Bruce's isolation and the gulf that separated him from his contemporaries rather than bridging those gaps. The academic achievements that Bruce accumulated during his formal education were remarkable by any standard, as he consistently excelled in every subject, while also pursuing independent research projects that demonstrated levels of intellectual sophistication that amazed his tutors and worried Alfred, who recognized that exceptional intelligence without adequate emotional development and social skills could become as much curse as blessing. The advanced placement courses and accelerated programs that were arranged to challenge Bruce's capabilities also served to separate him further from typical childhood experiences and peer relationships. The physical development that accompanied Bruce's intellectual growth was equally impressive, as the athletic training and martial arts instruction that Alfred provided produced capabilities that exceeded those of most adult athletes, while also instilling the kind of discipline and self-control that prevented his increasing strength from becoming a source of problems with teachers or classmates who might not understand the intensity that drove his pursuit of physical excellence. The charitable work that Bruce began participating in during his early teenage years provided some balance to his darker preoccupations, while also connecting him to the positive legacy of his parents' philanthropic activities, though even these experiences were filtered through his growing obsession with crime and its victims, as he seemed drawn to organizations that worked with those who had suffered from violence and injustice rather than the broader range of social causes that the Wayne Foundation traditionally supported. The international experiences that Alfred arranged during Bruce's teenage years were designed to broaden his perspective and provide exposure to different cultures and ways of thinking about social problems, yet these travels seemed to reinforce rather than moderate his developing worldview, as he focused on learning about law enforcement techniques and criminal justice approaches in various countries rather than appreciating the artistic and cultural treasures that would have enriched a normal young person's understanding of human achievement. The mentors and teachers who worked with Bruce during these formative years consistently reported their amazement at his intellectual capabilities, while also expressing concerns about his emotional development and the single-minded intensity that seemed to consume increasing amounts of his attention and energy. Alfred's conversations with these professionals provided insights into Bruce's psychological state, while also confirming his own growing recognition that the boy was following a path that would lead far from conventional definitions of success and happiness. The point of no return in Bruce's development seemed to arrive not with any dramatic announcement or sudden decision, but through the gradual accumulation of choices and commitments that made his ultimate destination increasingly inevitable, as his academic interests, physical training, social relationships, and personal values all aligned to support a future that Alfred could see approaching. Despite his hopes that circumstances might somehow redirect Bruce toward a more conventional and safer path, the conversations about Bruce's future that occurred with increasing frequency during his final years at home required Alfred to balance his role as loving guardian with his obligations as executor of Thomas Wayne's wishes and protector of the Wayne family legacy, recognizing that his personal desire to keep Bruce safe might conflict with the young man's right to choose his own path and his responsibility to use his inherited advantages in service of larger purposes than personal comfort and security. The network of contacts and resources that Alfred began developing during these years reflected his growing understanding that Bruce's chosen path would require support systems that extended far beyond what any single guardian could provide, no matter how capable and dedicated, as the young man's ambitions seemed to encompass challenges that would test every aspect of his remarkable capabilities, while also exposing him to dangers that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. The love that bound Alfred and Bruce together had evolved far beyond the formal relationship between guardian and ward to become something that neither had experienced before. A connection based on shared loss, mutual respect, and genuine affection that would endure through whatever trials lay ahead. even as both men recognized that Bruce's chosen destiny might ultimately require sacrifices that would test the strength of their bond in ways that neither wanted to contemplate too deeply. The transformation of the boy who had been orphaned by violence into the young man who would dedicate his life to fighting crime was neither sudden nor complete, but it was undeniably real, shaped by Alfred's guidance and support, yet ultimately driven by forces within Bruce himself that no external influence could have created or controlled, leaving Alfred to wonder whether he had helped raise a hero or enabled the creation of something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The return of Bruce Wayne to Gotham City in the autumn of 1978 marked not merely the conclusion of his extensive international education, but the beginning of a transformation that would test every aspect of Alfred's accumulated wisdom and challenge his understanding of duty, loyalty, and the terrible price that justice sometimes demands from those who choose to serve it without reservation or compromise. The young man who emerged from years of rigorous training in disciplines that few universities taught and fewer still acknowledged bore little resemblance to the traumatized child who had left Wayne Manor, yet the fundamental drive that had shaped his development remained unchanged, now focused with laser precision on objectives that filled Alfred with equal measures of pride and terror. The cave system beneath Wayne Manor, that would become the foundation of Bruce's war on crime, had been known to Alfred since his early days of managing the estate, initially catalogued as merely another architectural curiosity of a property that contained numerous hidden passages and forgotten chambers from its construction during Gotham's more turbulent early history. The extensive limestone caverns had served various purposes over the decades, from wine storage during Prohibition to air raid shelters during the war years, yet none of these previous uses had prepared Alfred for the transformation that Bruce envisioned as he began converting the largest chamber into something that defied easy categorization or comparison. The technical specifications that Bruce outlined for his underground headquarters reflected the synthesis of everything he had learned during his years of study and training, incorporating cutting-edge computer systems with advanced communications equipment, forensic laboratories with medical facilities, all integrated into a command center that would have impressed the intelligence services of major nations, while somehow maintaining the personal character that distinguished private initiative from institutional bureaucracy. The cost of these installations was staggering even by Wayne family standards, yet the resources were readily available thanks to the prudent management and continued growth of the Wayne fortune during Bruce's years of absence. The construction process that brought this underground complex into existence required Alfred to coordinate with specialists whose expertise was so narrow and sensitive that extensive security investigations were necessary before they could be permitted access to even portions of the project, while the need for absolute secrecy meant that much of the actual installation work had to be performed by Alfred himself, drawing upon technical skills he had acquired during his military service and subsequently refined through decades of maintaining the sophisticated systems that supported the Wayne family's various enterprises. The physical transformation of the cave space was matched by Alfred's own evolution from household manager to something approaching mission control operator, as Bruce's plans required support systems that went far beyond traditional domestic service to encompass roles that combined elements of intelligence analyst, tactical coordinator, medical technician, and confidential advisor, in ways that no previous employer had ever demanded or imagined. The additional training that Alfred undertook to prepare himself for these responsibilities included advanced courses in emergency medicine, computer systems operation, and communications technology that tested his capacity for learning new skills at an age when most men were contemplating retirement rather than embarking upon entirely new careers. The costume design and fabrication process that occupied months of careful experimentation and refinement revealed the extent to which Bruce had thought through every aspect of his intended mission, from the psychological impact of his appearance on both criminals and innocent bystanders, to the practical requirements of protection and mobility that would enable him to function effectively in the urban combat environment that Gotham City streets represented after dark. The selection of the bat motif was influenced by Bruce's childhood fear of the creatures that inhabited the cave system, transformed through years of psychological work into a symbol that he hoped would inspire similar terror in those who preyed upon the innocent. The weapons and equipment that Alfred helped design and construct represented a careful balance between effectiveness and Bruce's absolute prohibition against taking human life, a moral constraint that complicated every tactical decision while also distinguishing his mission from the simple vigilantism that had been attempted by previous individuals who lacked both his resources and his ethical framework. The non-lethal alternatives that they developed ranged from sophisticated restraint devices to advanced surveillance equipment, all designed to give Batman advantages that would compensate for his refusal to employ the ultimate solutions that his enemies would not hesitate to use against him. The first night that Bruce emerged from the cave wearing the Batman costume represented a moment of transformation that neither he nor Alfred could have fully anticipated, as the young man who had spent years preparing for this moment disappeared into a persona that seemed to possess its own independent existence and objectives. Alfred's monitoring of that initial patrol through the cave's communication systems provided him with his first real understanding of what Bruce had become and what their shared future would entail. As he listened to encounters with street criminals that demonstrated both the effectiveness of their preparations and the terrible dangers that would define every subsequent night, the medical expertise that Alfred had acquired during his military service proved invaluable during those early weeks of Batman's career, as Bruce returned from each patrol with injuries that ranged from minor cuts and bruises to serious wounds that would have required hospitalization for anyone lacking access to the sophisticated medical facilities that had been installed in the cave. The treatment protocols that Alfred developed for these situations drew upon battlefield medicine techniques, while also incorporating procedures designed specifically for the unique hazards that urban vigilantism presented, from dealing with unusual toxins employed by chemically sophisticated criminals to treating injuries inflicted by weapons that were rarely encountered in conventional medical practice. The intelligence-gathering systems that Alfred implemented to support Batman's mission represented a synthesis of methods he had learned during his intelligence service with modern computer technology and communications intercepts that provided real-time information about criminal activities throughout Gotham City. The network of informants and surveillance devices that he established and maintained required constant attention and periodic updating as criminals adapted their methods to counter Batman's activities, creating an ongoing technological arms race that tested Alfred's ability to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations. The moral guidance that Alfred attempted to provide during those early months of Batman's career became increasingly complex, as Bruce encountered situations that challenged his ethical principles while also threatening the lives of Batman's career, innocent people who depended upon his protection. The conversations that took place in the cave, after particularly difficult encounters, forced both men to grapple with questions about the limits of vigilante action and the acceptable costs of pursuing justice outside the conventional legal system, discussions that had no easy answers, but which were essential for maintaining the moral framework that distinguished Batman from the criminals he fought. The coordination with law enforcement that Alfred facilitated represented one of the most delicate aspects of Batman's operation, as his activities technically violated numerous laws, while also serving the broader cause of justice that police officers had sworn to uphold. The unofficial cooperation that gradually developed with certain members of the Gotham City Police Department required careful cultivation and absolute discretion, as any public acknowledgement of Batman's assistance could create political problems for officers who were already struggling to maintain order in a city where conventional law enforcement methods were increasingly inadequate. The financial management of Batman's mission required Alfred to develop expertise in areas that went far beyond traditional household accounting, as the costs of equipment, information, and operational support quickly reached levels that demanded careful budgeting, even given the Wayne family's substantial resources. The procurement of specialized materials and services often required complex arrangements with suppliers who could not be allowed to understand the ultimate purposes for which their products would be employed, creating logistical challenges that tested Alfred's diplomatic skills and creativity. The psychological toll that Batman's mission exacted upon both Bruce and Alfred became apparent within the first year of operations, as the constant exposure to Gotham City's worst criminal elements and most tragic victims created stresses that no amount of preparation could entirely mitigate. Alfred's role as confidant and emotional anchor became increasingly important as Bruce struggled to maintain his psychological equilibrium while confronting evidence of human evil that challenged his faith in the possibility of meaningful social progress through individual action. The evolution of Batman's methods and techniques during those formative months reflected both learning from experience and adaptation to the increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations that emerged to challenge his presence in Gotham City's underworld. The simple street criminals, who had been his initial targets, were gradually replaced by organized crime figures, and eventually by individuals whose capabilities and resources rivaled his own, forcing constant refinement of tactics and equipment that kept Alfred busy with research and development projects that consumed much of his time and attention. The secret identity maintenance that became an essential component of their operation required Alfred to develop elaborate systems for managing Bruce Wayne's public persona, while also ensuring that no connections could be drawn between the playboy billionaire and the mysterious vigilante who had begun attracting increasing attention from both media and law enforcement agencies. The social obligations that Bruce was required to fulfill as head of the Wayne family demanded careful scheduling to ensure that Batman's activities never conflicted with public appearances that were necessary for maintaining his cover identity. The first major criminal organization that Batman encountered represented a quantum leap in the complexity and danger of his mission, as the Falcone crime family possessed resources and connections that enabled them to corrupt law enforcement and judicial officials while also employing violence on a scale that dwarfed anything that individual street criminals could accomplish. Alfred's research into their operations and vulnerabilities required him to draw upon intelligence techniques that he had hoped never to use again, while also developing new methods for gathering information about targets who were sophisticated enough to employ counter-surveillance measures. The introduction of forensic science capabilities into Batman's arsenal reflected Alfred's recognition that fighting organized crime would require evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny if arrests were to result in successful prosecutions, rather than temporary inconveniences for criminal leaders. The laboratory equipment that he installed and learned to operate represented significant advances over what was available to most law enforcement agencies, providing Batman with analytical capabilities that often proved crucial in identifying perpetrators and linking them to specific crimes. The development of non-lethal alternatives to deadly force became an ongoing project that challenged Alfred's ingenuity, while also reflecting Bruce's absolute commitment to preserving human life, even when dealing with individuals who showed no similar restraint in their treatment of others. The various devices and techniques that they created ranged from sophisticated restraint systems to psychological warfare methods designed to capitalize on criminals' fears and superstitions, all aimed at achieving tactical objectives without crossing the moral lines that Bruce had established as inviolable boundaries. The communication systems that Alfred designed to maintain contact with Batman during his patrols incorporated multiple redundancies and encryption protocols that would have impressed intelligence professionals, while also providing the pate, reliability, and clarity that could mean the difference between success and disaster when split-second decisions were required in life-threatening situations. The coordination of information flow between the cave's computer systems and Batman's field equipment required constant monitoring and periodic upgrades as technology advanced and new threats emerged. The physical conditioning and medical support that Alfred provided to maintain Batman's effectiveness required him to become expert in athletic training methods and injury prevention techniques that went far beyond basic first aid to encompass the kind of comprehensive healthcare that elite athletes required to maintain peak performance despite constant physical stress. The rehabilitation protocols that he developed for treating the inevitable injuries that accumulated during Batman's activities drew upon sports medicine principles, while also addressing the unique demands of combat injuries and exposure to exotic toxins and unusual weapons. The emotional isolation that accompanied Batman's mission created challenges for both Bruce and Alfred, as the demands of maintaining secret identities and the psychological stresses of constant exposure to violence and criminality strained their ability to maintain normal human relationships. Outside their shared commitment to the war on crime, Alfred's role as the sole confidant who understood the complete scope of Bruce's activities made him both essential support system and potential weak point that enemies might target to compromise Batman's effectiveness. The evolution from individual vigilante to the foundation of what would eventually become a larger movement began during these early years, as Alfred and Bruce recognized that Gotham City's problems exceeded what any single person could address, no matter how capable or well-equipped. The planning for potential expansion of their mission and the recruitment of additional allies required careful consideration of security issues and operational procedures that would maintain effectiveness while also preserving the ethical principles that define their approach to crime. Fighting. The transformation of Alfred from butler to partner represented perhaps the most significant change in either man's life during these crucial years. As their relationship evolved from the traditional boundaries between employer and employee to something approaching equality based on mutual respect, shared commitment, and the recognition that their mission required contributions from both that were equally essential to success. The love and loyalty that had sustained them through Bruce's childhood had become the foundation for a partnership that would define both their destinies for decades to come. The arrival of Dick Grayson at Wayne Manor in the spring of 1981 brought with it a complexity of emotions and responsibilities that neither Alfred nor Bruce had anticipated, despite years of speculation about how their mission might eventually expand to include additional allies in the war against crime. The 9-year-old boy, whose parents had been murdered by criminals seeking to extort protection money from Haley's circus, carried with him not only his own profound trauma, but also uncomfortable parallels to Bruce's childhood tragedy that forced both men to confront aspects of their shared past, while also grappling with the immediate practical and emotional challenges of providing care for another young victim of Gotham City's endemic violence. The decision to take Dick into their home was not made lightly or quickly, requiring extensive consultations with child welfare authorities, careful consideration of the security implications for their ongoing operations, and honest discussions about whether Wayne Manor could provide the kind of stable, nurturing environment that the boy desperately needed, while also serving as the headquarters for activities that regularly exposed its inhabitants to mortal danger. Alfred's experience in raising Bruce provided valuable insights into the unique challenges of caring for a traumatized child, yet he also recognized that Dick's circumstances and temperament were sufficiently different to require entirely new approaches to education, emotional support, and integration into their unconventional household. The initial weeks following Dick's arrival were marked by the kind of careful observation and gentle probing that Alfred had learned to employ when assessing the psychological state of individuals who had been exposed to extreme trauma, as the boy's outward composure and apparent resilience masked deeper wounds that would require time and patience to heal properly. The circus background that had shaped Dick's early development had provided him with physical capabilities and emotional toughness that were remarkable for someone his age, yet had also exposed him to adult realities and moral complexities that complicated his ability to process his parents' deaths and adjust to the radically different lifestyle that Wayne Manor represented. The establishment of new household routines that could accommodate Dick's needs, while also maintaining the operational requirements of Batman's mission, required Alfred to demonstrate organizational skills that exceeded even his considérable prévious expérience, as the presence of an active, intelligent child created security challenges that demanded constant vigilance and creative solutions. The cave's sophisticated computer systems and weapon storage had to be secured against curious exploration, while the medical facilities and forensic laboratories required modifications that would prevent accidental exposure to dangerous materials or equipment that could cause serious injury to someone unfamiliar with proper safety procedures. The educational program that Alfred developed for Dick drew upon the same principles that had guided Bruce's intellectual development, yet was necessarily adapted to accommodate a child whose learning had been interrupted by tragedy and whose interests and aptitudes were shaped by experiences that were entirely different from those of a typical Wayne family heir. The formal academic instruction was supplemented by practical skills training that honored Dick's circus heritage, while also providing foundation for more advanced capabilities that might eventually prove valuable in ways that Alfred preferred not to contemplate too directly during those early months. The relationship between Bruce and Dick evolved gradually from the initial awkwardness of two individuals who shared similar losses but possessed vastly different personalities and approaches to dealing with grief and anger, developing into something that resembled the bond between older and younger brother, despite the significant age gap and the complex circumstances that had brought them together. Alfred's role as mediator and interpreter became crucial during the inevitable conflicts and misunderstandings that arose as both struggled to define their connection and establish boundaries that would allow them to coexist harmoniously within the unique environment of Wayne Manor. The physical training that Dick received began as simple exercise and recreational activities, designed to maintain the athletic conditioning that his circus background had provided, yet gradually expanded to encompass more specialized skills that reflected both his natural abilities and his growing awareness of the activities that occupied so much of Bruce's time and attention. Alfred's careful introduction of martial arts techniques and acrobatic exercises was presented as natural extensions of Dick's existing capabilities rather than preparation for potentially dangerous applications, though the boy's intelligence and perceptive nature made it increasingly difficult to maintain such pretenses as months passed. The emotional support that Alfred provided to Dick during his adjustment period required him to draw upon reserves of patience and empathy that had been developed through his years of caring for Bruce, yet also demanded new approaches that acknowledged the fundamental differences in their personalities and needs. Where Bruce had withdrawn into brooding isolation following his parents' deaths, Dick's response was characterized by restless energy and a need for action that made traditional counseling and quiet reflection less effective than more active forms of therapy and emotional processing. The gradual revelation of Batman's existence to Dick came not through any planned disclosure, but rather through the boy's inevitable discovery of inconsistencies and contradictions that his sharp mind was too keen to ignore indefinitely. As Bruce's frequent absences during nighttime hours and his unexplained injuries created questions that demanded answers more sophisticated than the cover stories that had been developed to protect the secret from casual observation. Alfred's role as intermediary in these conversations required delicate balance between honesty and protection, providing enough truth to satisfy Dick's curiosity while avoiding premature exposure to dangers that he was not yet prepared to understand or handle. The integration of Dick into the support structure of Batman's mission began tentatively and with significant reservations on Alfred's part, as he recognized that involving another child in activities that regularly resulted in life-threatening situations violated every instinct he possessed about proper guardianship and child welfare. Yet the boy's obvious intelligence, exceptional physical capabilities, and burning desire to contribute to the cause of justice that had failed his parents made it increasingly difficult to maintain his exclusion from activities that dominated the household's primary focus and consumed most of Bruce's waking hours. The training program that eventually formalized Dick's preparation for active participation in crime fighting reflected Alfred's determination to provide the most comprehensive preparation possible, while also attempting to minimize the risks that such involvement would inevitably entail. The curriculum that he developed incorporated everything he had learned about combat, surveillance, investigation, and survival during his own military and intelligence careers, adapted for someone whose youth and inexperience required different approaches than those that had been appropriate for training adult operatives and soldiers. The costume design and equipment selection process for what would become Robin's operational gear required Alfred to balance competing demands for protection, mobility, and psychological impact, while also considering the unique requirements of someone whose smaller size and different physical capabilities demanded specialized solutions that had never been necessary for Batman's equipment. The bright colors that were eventually selected served multiple purposes beyond simple visibility, including psychological warfare effects and tactical considerations that would prove their value during actual operations. The first joint patrols that brought Batman and Robin together as an operational team tested every aspect of Alfred's planning and preparation, as the theoretical training and simulated exercises that had occupied months of careful instruction were suddenly applied to real situations involving genuine dangers and life or death consequences that no amount of preparation could entirely simulate. The communication systems that connected both operatives to the cave's command center required Alfred to develop new protocols for managing dual operations, while also providing tactical support and emergency medical guidance that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The public reaction to Robin's appearance alongside Batman created new challenges for maintaining secret identities and managing media attention that had previously been focused solely on the mysterious adult vigilante whose activities were controversial enough without the additional complications that arose from involving someone who was obviously underage in potentially lethal confrontations with armed criminals. Alfred's management of public relations, aspects of their mission, required diplomatic skills and strategic thinking that went far beyond traditional household management to encompass political considerations and legal implications that could threaten their entire operation. The expansion of their criminal adversaries' attention to include Robin as a target for retaliation and psychological warfare created security concerns that exceeded even Alfred's extensive experience with protecting high-value individuals, as the boy's youth and relative inexperience made him vulnerable to manipulation and attacks that more seasoned operatives would be better equipped to recognize and counter. The additional protective measures that Alfred implemented included enhanced surveillance of Dick's school and social activities, closer coordination with trusted allies in law enforcement and other agencies, and development of emergency procedures that could rapidly extract him from situations that exceeded his ability to handle independently. The relationship dynamics between Alfred and the two young men under his care became increasingly complex, as both Bruce and Dick matured, and their partnership evolved from simple mentorship to something approaching equality in operational capability and tactical decision-making authority. Alfred's role as the stable center around which their activities revolved required him to balance competing needs and occasionally conflicting objectives, while maintaining the kind of supportive environment that would enable both to achieve their maximum potential without sacrificing their psychological well-being or moral principles. The introduction of additional allies and associates during this period reflected the growing recognition that Gotham City's problems exceeded what even a highly effective team of 3 could address comprehensively, leading to carefully managed relationships with individuals like Commissioner Gordon, whose official positions required delicate handling to avoid compromising their ability to cooperate while maintaining plausible deniability about the extent of their involvement with vigilante activities. Alfred's management of these relationships required the same kind of diplomatic skills he had employed during his intelligence career, balancing competing interests and managing information flow to maximize cooperation while minimizing risks to all parties involved. The technological advances that Alfred incorporated into their operations during this period reflected both the rapid pace of innovation in computer and communication systems and his recognition that their adversaries were similarly upgrading their capabilities in an ongoing arms race that required constant adaptation and improvement. The expansion of the cave's facilities to accommodate new equipment and additional personnel created logistical challenges that tested his project management skills, while also providing opportunities to implement improvements that had been identified during their early years of operation. The educational opportunities that Alfred arranged for Dick's continued intellectual development had to balance the requirements of maintaining his cover identity as Bruce Wayne's ward with the advanced knowledge and skills that his involvement in their mission demanded, creating a complex curriculum that combined traditional academic subjects with specialized training that few educational institutions could provide. The private tutoring and carefully selected extracurricular activities were designed to provide normal childhood experiences while also supporting the development of capabilities that would serve him well in his chosen path. The financial management of their expanded operations required Alfred to develop increasingly sophisticated accounting and procurement systems that could handle the growing costs of equipment, information, and operational support, while also maintaining the kind of detailed records that would satisfy auditors and regulatory authorities without revealing information that could compromise their activities. The legitimate business enterprises that provided cover for their expenditures required constant attention and periodic review to ensure that they remained credible and profitable while also serving their primary purpose as vehicles for supporting the war on crime. The medical and psychological support systems that Alfred maintained for both Bruce and Dick required constant updating and refinement as their activities exposed them to new forms of physical and emotional stress that tested the limits of their resilience and recovery capabilities. The treatment protocols that he developed for dealing with injuries and trauma drew upon the most advanced medical knowledge available, while also incorporating techniques and approaches that were specifically tailored to the unique demands of their lifestyle and mission. The social relationships that both Bruce and Dick attempted to maintain outside their vigilante activities created additional challenges for Alfred as he worked to support their efforts to experience normal human connections while also protecting their secret identities and managing the security risks that such relationships inevitably created. The careful balance between isolation and exposure required constant vigilance and periodic reassessment as circumstances changed and new threats emerged. The evolution of Alfred's own role from guardian and supporter to essential partner and strategic advisor reflected his growing understanding of the mission's complexity and his recognition that success would require contributions from all team members that went far beyond their originally defined responsibilities. The transformation from butler to something approaching chief of staff represented a fundamental change in how he viewed his own identity and purpose, yet was achieved without sacrificing the core values and principles that had always defined his approach to service and dedication. The long-term planning that Alfred began during this period reflected his understanding that their war on crime was likely to extend far into the future, requiring sustainable approaches to recruitment, training, equipment replacement, and succession planning that would ensure continuity, even if circumstances forced changes in personnel or methods. The strategic thinking that informed these preparations drew upon his military experience, while also acknowledging the unique characteristics of their mission that distinguished it from conventional military or law enforcement operations. The bonds of loyalty and affection that united Alfred, Bruce, and Dick during these formative years created a family structure that was unconventional yet remarkably effective in providing the kind of emotional support and shared purpose that enabled all three to achieve their individual potential, while also contributing to collective success that exceeded what any of them could have accomplished independently. The love that sustained their partnership would prove to be their greatest strength in the challenges that lay ahead, even as it also created vulnerabilities that their enemies would eventually attempt to exploit. The shadows that gathered around Alfred's past during the 1990s were not merely metaphorical darkness born of old secrets and classified operations, but tangible threads of connection to intelligence networks and clandestine organizations that had never truly released their hold upon those who had once served their purposes with distinction and unwavering loyalty. The retirement from active service that Alfred had believed would provide permanent separation from the world of espionage and international intrigue proved to be more illusion than reality, as former colleagues and institutional handlers continued to view him as a valuable asset whose unique position and capabilities made him too useful to abandon entirely to the comfortable obscurity of domestic service. The first indication that Alfred's past would not remain safely buried came in the form of apparently routine correspondence from the British consulate in Gotham City, official communications that ostensibly concerned matters of citizenship, documentation, and passport renewal, but which contained coded phrases and subtle references that immediately alerted him to their true purpose and origin. The intelligence services that had shaped his youth and early adulthood operated according to principles of long-term planning and resource management that did not recognize traditional concepts of retirement or civilian status, viewing former operatives as permanent investments whose value could be activated whenever circumstances demanded their specialized capabilities. The handler who eventually made direct contact with Alfred employed the kind of elaborate operational security that was simultaneously reassuring in its professionalism and disturbing in its implications for the level of surveillance and background investigation that must have preceded this approach. The meeting that took place in the apparently chance encounter at Gotham's Museum of Natural History provided cover for a conversation that revealed the extent to which his current activities and relationships had been monitored and analyzed by organizations whose interest in Batman's mission was motivated by considerations that went far beyond simple law enforcement cooperation. The requests for information and assistance that began as seemingly modest favors quickly escalated to demands that tested Alfred's ability to balance his loyalty to Bruce and Dick against obligations to former comrades and institutional authorities who possessed both the knowledge and the leverage necessary to create serious complications for their vigilante activities. The intelligence community's growing awareness of Batman's effectiveness and resources made him an attractive potential asset for operations that required capabilities and access that conventional government agencies could not easily provide, while also raising concerns about uncontrolled vigilante activities that might interfere with officially sanctioned missions. The network of contacts and informants that Alfred had maintained from his intelligence career provided valuable resources for supporting Batman's mission, offering access to information and capabilities that would have been otherwise impossible to obtain through civilian channels or conventional law enforcement cooperation. Yet these same connections also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services or criminal organizations seeking to compromise Batman's operations, requiring constant vigilance and careful assessment of the risks and benefits associated with each interaction and information exchange. The classified operations that Alfred had participated in during his years of active service continued to generate consequences and complications decades after their completion, as geopolitical changes and shifting alliances brought new attention to historical events that had been deliberately obscured or misrepresented in official records. The knowledge he possessed about certain activities and individuals made him a potential target for foreign intelligence services seeking to settle old scores or exploit embarrassing revelations, while also making him valuable to his own former employers who might require his testimony or cooperation in addressing challenges that arose from their previous actions. The investigation that Alfred conducted into his own past during this period was motivated by both security concerns and personal curiosity about the complete scope of his service and its long-term implications for his current life and relationships. The classified files and sealed records that he gradually accessed through former colleagues and institutional contacts revealed operations and connections that he had not been fully briefed about at the time, demonstrating the compartmentalized nature of intelligence work that prevented even experienced operatives from understanding the complete context and consequences of their actions. The surveillance capabilities that Alfred had developed for supporting Batman's mission proved invaluable when applied to monitoring the activities of those who were monitoring him, creating a complex web of observation and counter-observation that required constant management to prevent escalation into open conflict that might compromise everyone involved. The electronic countermeasures and communication security protocols that he implemented around Wayne Manor and their other facilities drew upon the most advanced techniques available, while also incorporating innovations that reflected his unique understanding of both offensive and defensive requirements. The moral complexities that arose from Alfred's continued connections to intelligence networks forced him to grapple with questions about loyalty and obligation that had no easy answers, as competing claims on his service and discretion created situations where satisfying one set of commitments necessarily meant disappointing or potentially betraying another. The decisions he made regarding which information to share and which secrets to protect required careful consideration of not only immediate consequences, but also long-term implications for the safety and effectiveness of everyone involved. The training and preparation that Alfred provided to Bruce and Dick during this period included enhanced instruction in counter-surveillance techniques and operational security measures that reflected his growing awareness of the sophisticated threats that their activities might attract from sources that went far beyond conventional criminal organizations. The lessons in tradecraft and security consciousness that he imparted drew upon decades of experience in environments where the smallest mistake or oversight could result in capture, torture, or death, knowledge that he hoped would never be necessary yet recognized as essential, given the expanding scope and complexity of their mission. The safe houses and emergency procedures that Alfred established during this period reflected his understanding that their primary base of operations might someday be compromised or rendered inaccessible, requiring backup facilities and contingency plans that could support continued operations, even under the most adverse circumstances. The network of secure locations and cached resources that he developed throughout Gotham City and the surrounding region incorporated lessons learned from resistance operations and clandestine networks that had successfully operated under hostile occupation, adapted to the unique requirements of urban vigilante activities. The financial arrangements that Alfred maintained with various intelligence-related organizations created sources of income and operational support that supplemented the Wayne family's resources, while also providing cover for activities and expenditures that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from regulatory authorities or criminal investigators. The careful balance between legitimate business relationships and covert operational support required constant attention to legal and security considerations that could become problematic if not managed with extraordinary care and discretion. The information networks that Alfred developed and maintained provided early warning about threats and opportunities that might affect Batman's mission, drawing upon sources that ranged from former intelligence colleagues to current operatives who shared information on an informal basis because of personal relationships and mutual respect rather than official cooperation agreements. The intelligence products that resulted from these relationships often proved crucial in planning operations and avoiding dangers that conventional sources would never have detected or understood. The enemies from Alfred's past who began to surface during this period included former targets of his operations who had achieved positions of power and influence that enabled them to pose genuine threats to his current life and relationships, requiring active measures to neutralize or contain their activities before they could cause irreparable damage to the Wayne family or their vigilante mission. The confrontation of these threats demanded skills and ruthlessness that Alfred had hoped never to employ again, yet which proved necessary to protect those he had come to love as his own family. The psychological toll that maintaining multiple identities and loyalties exacted upon Alfred became increasingly apparent as the demands of his various obligations created stress and internal conflict that affected his health and emotional well-being in ways that concerned both Bruce and Dick. Though neither fully understood the sources of his difficulties given the compartmentalized nature of his intelligence background and his determination to protect them from knowledge that might compromise their safety or mission. Effectiveness. The technological capabilities that Alfred's intelligence connections provided included access to equipment and information systems that were not available through commercial channels or conventional law enforcement cooperation, enhancing Batman's operational capabilities while also creating dependencies that could become problematic if those relationships were severed or compromised. The integration of classified technologies with their existing systems required careful evaluation of security implications and potential vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services might attempt to exploit. The diplomatic activities that Alfred occasionally undertook on behalf of his former employers involved leveraging his position and relationships to facilitate communications or negotiations that could not be conducted through official channels, making use of his apparent civilian status and social connections to provide cover for sensitive discussions that might affect international relations or security cooperation agreements. These activities required him to balance competing interests and maintain plausible deniability, while achieving objectives that served broader strategic purposes beyond his personal obligations. The recruitment approaches that various intelligence organizations made toward Bruce and Dick reflected their recognition of the unique capabilities and access that the Wayne family possessed, creating situations where Alfred had to protect his charges from pressures and temptations that might compromise their independence or moral principles, while also managing relationships with organizations that possessed the power to create serious problems if their approaches were handled inappropriately. The knowledge that Alfred possessed about criminal organizations and their intelligence connections provided valuable insights for Batman's operations, while also revealing the complex relationships between legitimate government agencies and criminal enterprises that sometimes made it difficult to distinguish between authorized operations and illegal activities. The information he shared with Bruce about these gray areas of law enforcement and intelligence work helped prepare him for the moral ambiguities and difficult choices that would inevitably arise during their mission. The legacy planning that Alfred began during this period reflected his recognition that his intelligence background created unique risks and obligations that would need to be addressed if circumstances prevented him from continuing to manage these relationships personally. The succession plans and contingency arrangements that he developed were designed to protect Bruce and Dick from the consequences of his past, while also ensuring that valuable intelligence, assets, and relationships could be preserved or safely terminated as appropriate. The isolation that Alfred experienced as the sole keeper of secrets that could not be shared with anyone, regardless of trust or affection, created emotional burdens that tested his psychological resilience, while also reinforcing his understanding of the loneliness that was inherent in lives dedicated to service that required constant deception and compartmentalization. The love and loyalty that bound him to Bruce and Dick provided meaning and purpose that sustained him through the darkest moments of doubt and fear, yet also created additional pressures as he worked to protect them from knowledge that might destroy their faith in him or compromise their mission. The balance between transparency and security that Alfred maintained in his relationships with Bruce and Dick required constant calibration, as their maturity and involvement in dangerous activities made them increasingly capable of understanding and handling sensitive information, while also making them more attractive targets for hostile intelligence services seeking to exploit their connections and capabilities. The gradual revelation of selected aspects of his background was managed with extraordinary care to provide necessary context and preparation, without overwhelming them with information that might prove more harmful than helpful. The transformation of Alfred's role from guardian and supporter to something approaching spy master and intelligence coordinator reflected the evolving nature of Batman's mission and the increasingly sophisticated threats that it knows attracted, requiring him to draw upon capabilities and resources that went far beyond traditional domestic service, while maintaining the appearance of conventional household management that protected their cover identities and operational security. The quiet hours that Alfred spent alone in his study during the final years of the 20th century were filled not with the restless energy that had once driven him through decades of active service, but with the deeper contemplation that comes to men who have lived long enough to see the full arc of their choices and their consequences reflected in the lives they have touched and the legacy they will leave behind. The leather-bound journals that occupied increasing amounts of his attention contained not merely household accounts and operational records, but the careful documentation of a life that had encompassed more experiences and responsibilities than most men could imagine, yet which he had somehow managed to weave into a coherent tapestry of service and dedication that had given meaning to every sacrifice and justified every difficult decision. The reflection upon his early choices that occupied much of Alfred's private thought during these contemplative years revealed patterns and connections that had not been apparent during the tumultuous decades when immediate concerns and pressing obligations had demanded his complete attention. The young man who had abandoned a promising theatrical career to answer his country's call to service could never have imagined the path that would lead from the stages of London to the battlefields of Europe, from the shadowy world of intelligence operations to the domestic tranquility of Wayne Manor, and finally to the underground cave where he had helped create something unprecedented in the annals of crime fighting. The alternative lives that Alfred might have lived haunted his quieter moments, not with regret, but with a kind of philosophical curiosity about the infinite complexity of human choice and circumstance that had shaped his destiny in ways that no amount of planning or foresight could have predicted or controlled. The actor who had once dreamed of bringing characters to life upon the stage had instead devoted his talents to supporting a real-life hero whose adventures exceeded anything that theatrical imagination could conceive, while the soldier and intelligence operative who had served his nation with distinction had found his true calling in the service of individuals whose mission transcended national boundaries to encompass universal principles of justice and calling the two human dignity. The assessment of his impact upon Bruce's development that Alfred conducted with the methodical thoroughness that characterized all his important endeavors revealed both achievements and failures that would influence his understanding of his own legacy for whatever years remained to him. The traumatized child who had been placed in his care following the Wayne family tragedy had grown into a man of extraordinary capability and unwavering moral conviction, yet the price of that transformation had included sacrifices and compromises that sometimes caused Alfred to question whether his guidance had been entirely beneficial, or whether different approaches might have produced outcomes that preserved more of Bruce's capacity for normal human happiness. The pride that Alfred felt in Bruce's achievements as both Batman and Bruce Wayne was tempered by awareness of the isolation and emotional costs that his chosen path had imposed upon him, creating a form of success that was undeniably meaningful, yet purchased through the surrender of possibilities and experiences that most people considered essential components of a fulfilling life. The question that troubled Alfred's conscience during his most honest moments of self-examination was whether his own dedication to duty and service had inadvertently encouraged Bruce to embrace similar extremes of self-sacrifice, passing on both the virtues and the limitations of a life devoted entirely to serving others at the expense of personal fulfillment. The relationship with Dick Grayson that had evolved from initial uncertainty to genuine paternal affection provided Alfred with evidence that his capacity for nurturing and guidance could produce different results under different circumstances. as the young man who had become Robin had somehow managed to maintain more of his natural warmth and social connections, despite his involvement in the same dangerous mission that had consumed so much of Bruce's emotional energy. The success of Dick's integration into both the vigilante world and normal society suggested that Alfred's methods were not inherently flawed, but rather that Bruce's particular combination of trauma, intelligence, and moral conviction had created unique challenges that no amount of wise guidance could entirely overcome. The expansion of their mission to include additional allies and associates during the 90s had tested Alfred's ability to adapt his approach to working with individuals whose backgrounds and motivations were entirely different from those of the Wayne family members who had been his primary focus for so many years. The young women and men who had joined their cause brought with them their own traumas and aspirations, requiring forms of support and guidance that drew upon all of Alfred's accumulated wisdom, while also demanding new approaches that acknowledged their unique needs and capabilities. The moments of doubt and uncertainty that had periodically troubled Alfred throughout his years of service to the Wayne family were examined during these reflective periods with the kind of rigorous honesty that he had always demanded of himself in matters of genuine importance. The decisions he had made regarding Bruce's training and preparation, the level of support he had provided for increasingly dangerous activities, the balance he had maintained between protective concern and respect for autonomous choice, all were subjected to careful analysis that sought to identify both successes and failures that might inform whatever guidance he could still provide. The consideration of retirement that occupied increasing amounts of Alfred's attention during this period was complicated by his recognition that his role in supporting Batman's mission had evolved far beyond anything that could be easily transferred to a successor or abandoned without too serious consequences for the effectiveness and safety of everyone involved. The knowledge and capabilities that he had developed over decades of service were not merely professional skills that could be taught to a replacement, but rather the product of unique experiences and relationships that could not be replicated through conventional training or preparation. The plans for succession that Alfred began developing during this contemplative period reflected both his practical understanding of the importance of continuity in their operations and his emotional recognition that his advanced age and accumulating health concerns made it increasingly likely that circumstances would eventually force his withdrawal from active participation in their mission. The identification and training of potential successors required careful consideration of security implications and operational requirements that went far beyond simple household management to encompass the full range of support activities that had become essential to Batman's effectiveness. The financial arrangements that Alfred refined during these years were designed to ensure that the Wayne family's resources would continue to support their mission regardless of changes in personnel or circumstances that might affect the traditional management structures that had served them well for so long. The trust funds and investment strategies that he established incorporated lessons learned from decades of managing the complex financial requirements of vigilante activities, while also providing for contingencies that reflected his understanding of the various threats and challenges that might emerge in future years. The archive of records and documentation that Alfred compiled during this period represented his recognition that the history of their mission deserved preservation, not only for its potential value to future crime fighters, but also as a testament to the achievements and sacrifices of those who had dedicated their lives to the cause of justice. The careful balance between historical accuracy and operational security that characterized these records reflected his understanding that some stories could be told completely, while others required careful editing to protect ongoing activities and the safety of those who continued to serve. The letters and messages that Alfred prepared during these years were intended to provide guidance and encouragement to Bruce, Dick, and the other members of their extended family for situations and challenges that he might not be present to address personally. The wisdom and affection contained in these communications reflected decades of experience in supporting individuals who had chosen to risk everything in service of principles that transcended personal comfort and safety, offering insights that could only come from someone who had observed their struggles and triumphs from the unique perspective of unconditional loyalty and support. The assessment of Gotham City's progress during the years of Batman's activity provided Alfred with evidence that their mission had achieved genuine and lasting improvements in the lives of ordinary citizens, despite the seemingly endless nature of the challenges they faced and the constant emergence of new threats that tested their capabilities and resolve. The statistical analysis of crime rates and the qualitative evaluation of social conditions revealed patterns of improvement that justified the sacrifices and risks that had characterized their approach to urban problems that conventional institutions had been unable to address effectively. The relationships with law enforcement and civic organizations that Alfred had helped develop and maintain over the years had evolved into forms of cooperation that enhanced the effectiveness of all parties while also creating institutional knowledge and capabilities that would continue to serve the cause of justice even if Batman's direct involvement were to end. The network of allies and supporters that had grown around their mission represented a form of legacy that extended beyond individual heroism to encompass broader social change that reflected the values and principles that had guided their activities. The moral framework that had sustained Alfred throughout his years of service to causes that demanded extraordinary sacrifice and unwavering commitment was subjected to final examination during these contemplative periods, not because he doubted its validity, but because he wanted to understand completely the principles that had shaped his choices and guided his actions. The conclusions he reached about the relationship between duty and happiness, service and fulfillment, individual sacrifice and collective benefit would inform the guidance he continued to provide, while also offering him peace regarding the path his life had taken. The love that bound Alfred to Bruce, Dick, and the other members of their chosen family had deepened over the years into something that transcended traditional categories and conventional understanding, creating bonds of loyalty and affection that had sustained all of them through trials that would have broken lesser relationships. The recognition that this love had been both his greatest strength and his most profound responsibility provided Alfred with clarity about the meaning and purpose of his life that few individuals are privileged to achieve. The legacy that Alfred contemplated during these reflective years encompassed not only his own achievements and contributions, but also his role in enabling the achievements of others whose heroic actions had made a genuine difference in the world. The understanding that his service had multiplied the positive impact that exceptional individuals could have upon their communities provided him with satisfaction that no personal accomplishments could have equaled, while also reinforcing his conviction that the highest forms of human achievement often involve empowering others to reach their full potential. The quiet heroism that had characterized Alfred's entire adult life was perhaps most clearly visible during these final active years, as he continued to provide essential support and guidance while gradually preparing for transitions that would ensure continuity of their mission regardless of his personal circumstances. The courage required to face one's own mortality while maintaining absolute commitment to the welfare of others represented the culmination of a lifetime devoted to principles that had never wavered despite countless challenges, temptations to choose easier paths. The servant who had become the foundation upon which heroes stood had achieved a form of greatness that required no public recognition or official acknowledgement. finding fulfillment in the knowledge that his contributions had enabled achievements that would long outlast his own life, while serving causes that reflected humanity's highest aspirations for justice, compassion, and the protection of the innocent. The man who had chosen duty over personal ambition, service over self-interest, and love over recognition had created a legacy that would continue to inspire and guide those who followed in his footsteps long after his own story had ended. And so we close the leather-bound journal of Alfred Pennyworth's extraordinary life, a testament to the truth that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes the greatest among them wear not capes but simple vests, carry not weapons but wisdom, fight not with fists but with unfailing faith in those they serve. In his quiet dignity and endless devotion, we find the beating heart that sustains not just Wayne Manor, but the very mission that protects Gotham City. His story reminds us that behind every great hero stands someone equally heroic, someone who chooses service over self, duty over dreams, love over recognition. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the shadows, a faithful guardian watches over those he has chosen to protect, his own heroic journey. A whisper in the wind, a light in the darkness that asks for no thanks but gives everything. Sleep peacefully, dear dreamer, in the knowledge that true nobility lies not in birth but in choice, not in titles but in service, not in glory but in the quiet courage to stand behind those who stand for justice.